Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask for your help. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows me to keep bringing you these deep dives into history's darkest mysteries. Also, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's amazing to know this community spans the entire globe. Before we begin, I want to give a huge thank you to Grassblazer for suggesting tonight's topic. This one's for you. Now, let's get into it. The Fourth Exit. The fictional story of Hitler's escape intro. The uncovered dossier. The folder shouldn't have existed. Eamon Weiss knew that the moment his fingers touched the brittle manila edge, jutting from between two files marked Agricultural Trade 1947. He was 3 months into his graduate research fellowship at the Buenos Aires National Archives, scanning declassified Argentine intelligence documents for his thesis on post-war immigration policy. The work was tedious, mind-numbing even. Most days he found nothing but bureaucratic paperwork, visa applications stamped with fading ink, and shipping manifests listing cargo that had long since rotted away. The archive reading room was empty that afternoon, which was unusual even for August, when most researchers fled Buenos Aires for somewhere cooler. The air conditioning rattled and wheezed, barely keeping pace with the oppressive humidity that turned every page he touched slightly damp. Eamon had been working since 9 that morning, sustained only by bitter coffee from the machine in the hallway, and the distant hope that his thesis might actually contain something interesting. But on that humid August afternoon in 2019, everything changed. The unmarked folder had no catalogue number, no reference code, no official stamp. Someone had simply placed it there, wedged between documented history like a secret waiting to be discovered, or perhaps like evidence someone meant to file properly but never did. The folder itself was old, genuine 1940s vintage by the look of it, not a reproduction. Eamon pulled it free with the care his archival training demanded, though his hands were already shaking with the instinct that he'd found something significant. He opened it on the desk, and what he found inside would consume the next 6 months of his life and nearly end it. First there was a photograph, black and white, creased at the corners, clearly taken in the late 1940s based on the clothing style and photographic quality. The image quality suggested it had been taken with a decent camera, not the snapshot quality of amateur photography. It showed a man standing on a wooden dock, mountains rising behind him in sharp peaks that could only be the Andes, a lake spreading out into the distance with that particular clarity of high-altitude water. The man wore a dark suit that looked expensive, European cut, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, but not low enough. His moustache was unmistakable, that distinctive shape that had been caricatured 1,000,000 times. His posture was unmistakable, that particular stiffness that came from military bearing and possibly from the chronic back pain historical records documented. The resemblance to Adolf Hitler was impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away as coincidence. Eamon felt his mouth go dry. This couldn't be what it looked like. It had to be someone who resembled Hitler, or a doctored photo, or some kind of elaborate hoax. But the photograph had that quality of authenticity that came from genuine period materials. The paper stock was right. The chemical degradation patterns were consistent with a 70-year-old image. This wasn't created on a computer. Beneath the photo was a typed message on yellowed paper, the kind of onion skin paper used for carbon copies in the 1940s. The text was in German, typed on what appeared to be a German-manufactured typewriter based on the character shapes. Der Führer lebt. The leader lives. No punctuation, no signature. Just those 3 words that upended 70 years of accepted history. The third item was a flight log, or what appeared to be one. The document was official, stamped with Luftwaffe insignia that Eamon recognised from his studies. The header read May 1945, Luftwaffe Transport Division, Special Operations Command. A list of names followed, most redacted with heavy black ink, but one remained visible, typed clearly: A.H. Weber, A.H. Weber, Adolf Hitler Weber. Or perhaps just a coincidence, except there were no coincidences in a folder like this. The flight log listed departure from Tempelhof Airport in Berlin on May 1st, 1945. Destination, Barcelona, with a notation that read, continuing transport arranged. Continuing transport to where? Finally, there was a sealed envelope, or what had once been sealed. The wax seal had cracked with age, deep fissures running through what appeared to be an official government seal, though too degraded to identify which government. The words stamped across the envelope in faded blue ink were still legible. 11th of July, 45, Naval Intelligence, eyes only. Eamon stared at the envelope for a long moment. Part of him wanted to leave it sealed, to photograph the folder as he'd found it and report it to the head archivist. Let someone else deal with whatever was inside. Let someone else take responsibility for whatever truth or lie this represented. But he had come to Argentina to find something meaningful, something that would make his dissertation matter. And whether this was real or an elaborate fraud, it was certainly meaningful. He carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed on what appeared to be Argentine Naval Intelligence letterhead. The text was in Spanish, and it made Eamon's heart stop. Confirmed arrival of package Alpha via U-boat transport. Subject transferred to Interior Ministry custody as arranged. Recommend maximum security protocol. Subject identification matches provided photographs and physical description. No further naval involvement required. All records to be classified highest level. Package Alpha. Arrived via U-boat. July 11th, 1945. Eamon sat back in his chair, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. This couldn't be real. Adolf Hitler died in his bunker in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. Everyone knew that. It was historical fact, documented, verified, accepted by every serious historian in the world. The Soviets found his body. The war ended. The world moved on. Justice, such as it was served. But the documents in front of him told a different story, and someone had tried very hard to make sure that story stayed buried. Eamon looked around the empty reading room. The security camera in the corner was the old kind, probably not even functional. The archive clerk had left for lunch an hour ago. He was alone with these documents, alone with a secret that could either make his career or destroy his credibility forever. He took out his phone and began photographing everything. Each page, each angle, the envelope, the stamps, every detail. His hands shook so badly the first few photos came out blurred, but he steadied himself and continued. This was too important to mess up. When he finished, he carefully returned everything to the folder and marked his place in the catalogue with a bookmark. He needed time to think, to verify, to figure out what he'd actually found before he showed this to anyone. He left the archives in a daze, walking out into the bright Buenos Aires afternoon without any memory of gathering his things or signing out. The city moved around him, tango music drifting from a cafe, tourists photographing the colourful buildings of La Boca, life continuing as it always had. But Eamon Weiss knew that his life had just changed forever. He'd found something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged everything he thought he knew about history. And deep down, in a place he was afraid to examine too closely, he believed it might be real. Act 1. The final days in Berlin. To understand how the impossible might have become possible, Eamon had to go back to the beginning. Back to those final chaotic days in Berlin when the Third Reich collapsed and the Führer allegedly took his own life. Over the next 2 weeks, Eamon barely slept. He spent his days in the archives, maintaining the appearance of normal research, but his nights were devoted to studying everything he could find about Hitler's final days. He ordered books through international shipping, downloaded declassified intelligence reports, and contacted colleagues who specialised in the period without revealing why his interest had suddenly become so intense. The established historical record was clear, at least on the surface. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet forces closing in on the Reich Chancellery and artillery shells falling on the government quarter every few minutes, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in the Führer bunker beneath the city. According to the testimony of witnesses, Hitler shot himself while Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried up to the garden, doused in gasoline, and burned in a shell crater while the battle raged around them. The next day, May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children and then took their own lives. By May 2nd, the Soviets had captured Berlin. The war in Europe was over, or would be within days. But even the official story had cracks in it from the very beginning. Cracks that had never been adequately explained. Cracks that historians had smoothed over with assumptions and reasonable speculation, because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. The first problem was simple but profound. No Western Allied forces ever saw Hitler's body. The Soviets controlled the bunker and conducted their own investigation entirely in secret. They claimed to have found remains, but the evidence was contradictory and kept classified for decades. When Stalin met with Western leaders at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, he made a shocking statement. In July 1945, at the Potsdam Conference where the victorious Allies met to decide the fate of post-war Europe, Stalin told US and British diplomats something that should have raised more questions than it did. When asked directly about Hitler's death, Stalin said plainly that Hitler had escaped. He suggested the former Führer might be hiding in Spain or Argentina, protected by fascist sympathisers who had survived the war. President Truman and Prime Minister Churchill dismissed this as Soviet paranoia or propaganda, another example of Stalin's tendency toward conspiracy thinking. But Stalin's statement was on the record, documented in official conference notes. Why would the Soviet leader, who controlled the bunker and allegedly had Hitler's remains in Soviet custody, claim the man had escaped? What possible reason would he have to make such a claim unless he genuinely believed it, or knew it to be true? Years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian investigators would admit that the remains they initially identified as Hitler's lacked proper verification. The dental records were inconclusive, and based on testimony from witnesses interrogated under duress. The skull fragment that supposedly proved Hitler's death, kept in Moscow's state archive and occasionally displayed as a macabre trophy, turned out after DNA testing in 2009 to belong to a woman, probably someone who died in the bunker complex, but certainly not Adolf Hitler. These weren't conspiracy theories. These were documented historical contradictions, admitted by official sources, published in peer-reviewed journals. The problem was that most people, even historians, simply assumed the Soviets had been incompetent, rather than that they had been deceived, or that Hitler had actually escaped. It was easier to believe in Soviet bungling than to question the fundamental narrative of how the war ended. Eamon spent weeks in the archives, cross-referencing everything he could find about Berlin's final days. He discovered that the chaos of that period created a perfect storm of confusion that could have allowed an elaborate deception to succeed. Thousands of Nazi officials fled the city in the last weeks of the war, disappearing into the rubble and smoke. Some escaped through secret tunnels that connected government buildings to the subway system. Others used forged documents and friendly contacts. Many simply put on civilian clothes and walked out of the city amid the flood of refugees. The Führer bunker itself was a maze of corridors and exits, far more complex than popular imagination suggested. While everyone focused on the main entrance through the Reich Chancellery gardens, other passages led to subway tunnels, maintenance shafts, and emergency routes that connected to other government bunkers and facilities. The bunker had been designed with multiple escape routes because Hitler was paranoid about being trapped underground during an air raid. If someone wanted to stage a death and disappear, The bunker's final hours would have been the perfect opportunity. The complex was under constant artillery bombardment. The few remaining staff were exhausted, terrified, and increasingly drunk as the Reich's alcohol supplies were consumed in a final bout of abandon. Visibility in the garden where the bodies were allegedly burned was nearly zero due to smoke from fires burning throughout the government quarter. The witnesses to Hitler's death were few, and their testimony was contradictory. His valet said he'd seen the bodies. His secretary said she'd only heard the gunshot. The SS guards who allegedly carried the bodies up to the garden and burned them gave testimonies that varied significantly in details. Some said the fire burned for hours, others said only for minutes. Some described bodies burned beyond recognition. Others said the faces were still identifiable, and crucially, the person most qualified to identify Hitler's body, his personal physician Theodor Morell, had left the bunker days before the alleged suicide. The dentist who could have definitively identified Hitler from dental records, Hugo Blaschke, had also fled Berlin. The only person left who knew Hitler's dental work intimately was Kader Heusermann, Blaschke's assistant, and she fell into Soviet hands where her testimony would be controlled entirely by Stalin's investigators. Eamon found something else interesting in his research. In the final weeks, Hitler had become increasingly obsessed with the fate of Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator who had been captured by partisans and executed. His body hung upside down in a public square for crowds to abuse. Hitler had reportedly told his inner circle that he would never allow himself to be captured, never allow his body to become a trophy for his enemies. What if that obsession had led to planning an escape? What if the suicide story was exactly what Hitler wanted his enemies to believe, so they'd stop looking for him? But escaping Berlin was only the first step. Getting out of Germany entirely, with every Allied soldier and intelligence agent in Europe looking for Nazi leaders, would have required extensive planning, significant resources, and a network of supporters willing to risk everything. Which is exactly what Eamon discovered existed. Act 2. The Escape Plan, the Rat Lines. That's what intelligence agencies called them after the war. The Rat Lines. Escape routes that allowed Nazi war criminals to flee Europe and disappear into South America, the Middle East, and other safe havens far from Allied justice. These weren't rumours or theories. The rat lines were real, documented networks that operated with stunning efficiency in the immediate post-war years. Eamon spent days reading declassified CIA and FBI files that detailed these networks, and what he found was both fascinating and disturbing. The routes ran through Italy, Spain, and Portugal, facilitated by sympathetic officials, corrupt bureaucrats who could be bribed, and even elements within the Catholic Church who saw Nazis as potential allies against communism. The most famous route ran from Germany through Austria to Genoa, then by ship to Buenos Aires. Another went through Rome, where a Croatian priest named Krunoslav Draganovic operated what essentially amounted to a Nazi underground railroad, providing false papers, money, and passage to war criminals seeking to escape justice. Draganovic was a fascinating character. A Catholic priest with connections to the Vatican, he'd been involved in Croatian fascist movements during the war. After 1945, he set up operations in Rome, ostensibly helping refugees, but in reality running a sophisticated smuggling operation that moved hundreds of Nazi war criminals to safety. He worked out of a seminary, had access to Vatican resources, and was protected by diplomatic immunity. The Allies knew what he was doing, but chose not to intervene, partly because they'd begun recruiting some of the same Nazis for intelligence work against the Soviet Union. The names of those who successfully used these networks reared like a roster of the Third Reich's most wanted, and Eamon documented everyone he could find. Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Holocaust and administrator of the Final Solution, lived openly in Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement for over a decade before Israeli agents kidnapped him in 1960. He worked at a Mercedes-Benz factory, lived in a modest house, and felt safe enough to occasionally speak about his past to German expat friends who shared his ideology. Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death who conducted horrific medical experiments at Auschwitz, lived in Argentina and Paraguay for decades, protected by local Germans and corrupt officials. He eventually drowned in Brazil in 1979, never having faced justice for his crimes. For years he practiced medicine under his own name in Buenos Aires. That's how safe he felt. Erich Priebke, SS captain responsible for the massacre at the Ardeatine Caves, where 335 Italian civilians were murdered, lived peacefully in Bariloche, Argentina for almost 50 years before he was finally arrested in 1994. He ran a delicatessen, was active in the German community, and only faced consequences when someone recognised him from a documentary. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon responsible for torture and murder of French resistance members, was actually recruited by US intelligence before being smuggled to Bolivia, where he lived under protection until 1983. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka and Sobibor death camps, escaped to Brazil via the Rat Line and lived there until 1967. The list went on and on, hundreds of documented cases, and those were just the ones that were eventually caught or identified. How many others disappeared successfully and died in comfortable obscurity? These men didn't sneak out of Europe in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had help, organised and systematic help, from networks that remained operational for years after the war's end. They travelled with false papers that were good enough to pass official scrutiny. They had money, often quite a lot of it, that had been smuggled out of Germany before the end. They had contacts waiting for them at their destinations, ready to provide housing and jobs and protection. But what Eamon found next suggested something even more disturbing. Something that indicated the Rat Line networks weren't just helping random Nazi war criminals escape, but had been used for someone of the highest possible importance. In the Vatican secret archives, recently made available to researchers after decades of restriction, there was a reference in a 1946 document to what was described as a priority passenger moved through the Italian Rat Line in May 1945. Eamon had gained access to these archives through his university's connections, requesting documents related to post-war refugee movements. What he found was a memo from Bishop Alois Hudal, a Nazi sympathiser who had helped organise escape routes, to Vatican Secretary of State. The memo was carefully worded, using euphemistic language, but the implications were clear. It described arrangements for a priority passenger of utmost historical significance, who required absolute discretion and maximum security measures. The passenger's identity was redacted in the document, blacked out with ink so thick it had bled through to the other side of the paper. The destination was listed only as South Atlantic destination, arrangements coordinated with Argentine representatives. The timing was perfect, almost too perfect to be coincidence. Early May 1945, right after Hitler's supposed death, right when chaos in Europe was at its peak, and tracking individuals was nearly impossible. The term priority passenger was unusual in Rat Line documentation. Most papers referred to refugees, displaced persons, or occasionally special cases when dealing with Nazi officials. But priority passenger suggested someone of extreme importance, someone who required the highest level of secrecy and protection, someone whose escape was worth considerable risk and resources. Eamon couldn't prove the priority passenger was Hitler, but he couldn't rule it out either, and the timing, the level of secrecy, the involvement of the highest Vatican officials all suggested someone far more important than the typical Nazi war criminal fleeing justice. And then there were the U-boats. This was where Eamon's investigation took on a new dimension of plausibility, because the submarine story was entirely documented, entirely real, and entirely unexplained by conventional history. In July and August 1945, 2 German submarines surrendered in Argentina under circumstances that remain unexplained to this day. U-530 arrived in Mar del Plata on July 10th, 1945, more than 2 months after Germany's surrender on May 8th. U-977 appeared in August. again weeks after the war had ended. Both submarines had left Norway in early May with crews that refused to explain where they had been or what they had been doing for the intervening months. Eamon found the interrogation reports in Argentine naval archives. The questioning had been perfunctory at best, with Argentine authorities seeming more interested in getting the crews off their hands than in discovering the truth. The German sailors claimed they'd been at sea, unaware the war had ended, and had only surfaced when their supplies ran low. But this explanation made no sense. German U-boats had radios. They would have heard about the surrender. They would have known the war was over, and both submarines had left Norway at almost exactly the same time, following what appeared to be pre-arranged routes to the same destination. That wasn't coincidence. That was coordination. What's more, both submarines had far more range than necessary to reach Argentina. They could have surrendered to Allied forces in the Atlantic. They could have gone to a neutral port in South America's north. Instead, they'd travelled all the way to Argentina's southern coast, as far from Allied control as possible. Argentine authorities interviewed the crews, but found their stories evasive and contradictory. The submarines were impounded. The crews eventually repatriated to Germany, or allowed to stay in Argentina if they chose, and the incident was largely forgotten amid the chaos of the post-war period. But Eamon discovered something in the Argentine naval archives that had never been publicly disclosed, something that made his hands shake when he found it in a box of unsorted documents. A memo dated July 15th, 1945, 5 days after U-530's arrival, referenced an unmanifested passenger aboard the submarine. The passenger had allegedly disembarked before the submarine's official surrender and had been transferred to protective custody per arrangements with Interior Ministry. The passenger's identity was not listed. The passenger's nationality was not listed. But the memo included one detail that made Eamon's skin crawl. Subject matches description provided in communique from Allied intelligence dated May 2nd, forwarded via diplomatic channels. What communique? What description? May 2nd was 2 days after Hitler's supposed death, the same day the Soviets announced they'd captured Berlin and found his body. Eamon searched for weeks but found nothing more. If such a document existed, if Allied intelligence had circulated a description of someone they were looking for, it had been removed from the files or never archived in the first place. But the reference existed, buried in an obscure naval memo that no one had thought to classify, because no one had connected it to anything significant. But Eamon was connecting it now. A priority passenger leaving Italy in early May. A U-boat arriving in Argentina in July with an unmanifested passenger. A passenger who matched a description from Allied intelligence dated just after Hitler's reported death. The pattern was there, if you knew to look for it. One thing particularly interested Eamon about the U-boat story. Both submarines that arrived in Argentina had been fitted with snorkel systems, a German innovation that allowed U-boats to run their diesel engines while submerged just below the surface. This technology extended their range dramatically and allowed them to cross the Atlantic without surfacing, making them nearly invisible to Allied patrols. If you wanted to transport someone across the Atlantic in secret, a snorkel-equipped U-boat would be the perfect vehicle. Invisible, self-contained, able to stay submerged for weeks at a time. The passenger would be uncomfortable, certainly, living in the cramped conditions of a submarine for 2 months, but alive and undiscovered. Eamon found one more detail that seemed significant. U-530's commander, Otto Wehrmuth, had refused to explain their mission even under interrogation. Years later, after being allowed to settle in Argentina, Wehrmuth gave a single interview to a German-language newspaper in Buenos Aires. In that interview, he made a strange comment. "We carried out our final orders to the letter. What those orders were, I will take to my grave." Wehrmuth died in 1976. Whatever he knew, he kept his word. The implication was clear. Someone important had arrived in Argentina on a U-boat in July 1945. Someone the Argentine government was expecting. Someone they were prepared to protect, someone whose presence was so sensitive that all records had to be suppressed. But who could be that important? Who could command such resources, such loyalty, such elaborate arrangements? Eamon knew the answer. He just had to prove it. Act 3. Argentina's role. To understand why Argentina would shelter the most wanted man in the world, you had to understand Juan Domingo Perón and the unique political and social environment of Argentina in the immediate post-war years. Perón was Argentina's president from 1946 to 1955, and again from 1973 until his death in 1974. But in the immediate post-war years, he served as Secretary of Labour and Vice President under President Edelmiro Farrell, positions he used to implement what would become known in whispered conversations among intelligence agencies as his Nazi safe haven program. This wasn't a conspiracy theory or a matter of historical debate. Perón's government openly welcomed Nazi fugitives, though they denied the fugitives were war criminals and insisted they were simply German immigrants seeking a fresh start. Argentina issued thousands of landing permits to Germans, Austrians and Croatians with suspicious backgrounds and often with demonstrably false papers. The country became a refuge for war criminals, SS officers, and high-ranking Nazi officials who feared prosecution at Nuremberg or by Soviet forces. Why would Argentina do this? Eamon found several intersecting reasons as he researched Perón's motivations. First, Perón admired European fascism and saw it as a model for his own political movement, which he called justicialism, but which bore strong resemblances to Italian fascism in its corporatist structure and cult of personality. Perón had served as a military observer in Italy before the war and had been impressed by Mussolini's methods of social control and mass mobilization. Second, Argentina had a large German immigrant population, over 500,000 people by some estimates, and strong cultural ties to Germany. German Argentines were a prosperous and influential community, and they lobbied heavily for the government to help their countrymen escape what they characterized as Allied persecution. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Perón believed that bringing in German technical expertise, even if it meant harboring war criminals, would help modernize Argentina's military and industrial sectors. He wanted scientists, engineers and military specialists who could help Argentina become a major power. The Nazi regime had developed advanced technology in rocketry, jet aircraft and other fields, and Perón wanted access to that knowledge. And fourth, Perón saw the incoming Cold War clearly. He believed that the West would eventually need allies who weren't squeamish about dealing with former Nazis, that anti-communism would trump concerns about war crimes. He was largely proven right. Within a few years, both the United States and Britain were recruiting former Nazi scientists and intelligence officers for their own purposes. The policy was so well known that Israeli intelligence services spent years tracking Nazi fugitives in Argentina. The Simon Wiesenthal Center documented hundreds of cases. Some Nazis lived under their own names, like Erich Priebke. Others used thin aliases but made no real effort to hide, like Adolf Eichmann, who was listed in the Buenos Aires phone book under his alias. They felt safe because they were safe. The Argentine government protected them, and local police forces were ordered not to cooperate with foreign investigators seeking war criminals. When Israeli agents kidnapped Eichmann in 1960, it caused a major diplomatic incident, with Argentina protesting the violation of its sovereignty, not because they cared about Eichmann, but because they'd promised protection to Nazi refugees, and the kidnapping made them look weak. Among the locations favoured by Nazi expatriates was the town of San Carlos de Bariloche, usually just called Bariloche, in Argentina's Patagonia region. Eamon travelled there in September, 3 weeks after finding the mysterious folder, and what he discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. Bariloche sat nestled in the Andes foothills on the shores of Lake Nahuel Huapi, one of Argentina's most beautiful natural settings. The town looked like it had been transplanted directly from Bavaria. The architecture was alpine, all wooden chalets and steep pitched roofs designed for snow loads. The population was heavily German, with German language signs on shops and German cultural centres that were really social clubs for expatriates. The landscape was stunning, remote, and easy to defend, with only a few roads leading in and out through mountain passes that could be watched or blocked. It was the perfect place to disappear, and dozens of Nazi war criminals had done exactly that. Yaman spent days at the local historical society, which occupied a building that had once been a German social club. The staff were friendly, but became noticeably less so when Eamon explained his research interest. Bariloche had complicated feelings about its Nazi past. On one hand, it was documented history that couldn't be denied. On the other hand, it was bad for tourism and embarrassing for the current generation, who had nothing to do with harbouring war criminals, but bore the stigma anyway. The historical society's archives were incomplete, with notable gaps in documentation from the late 1940s and early 1950s. Building permits were missing. Property transfer records had disappeared. Immigration documentation that should have existed simply wasn't there. Someone, at some point, had cleaned the archives of anything too sensitive. But Eamon was persistent, and he found things that had been overlooked. One property in particular had always attracted attention. Inalco House. Also called Residencia Inalco, it had been built in 1943 by a German businessman named Jorge Antonio, though his actual nationality was disputed. The mansion was enormous by local standards, built on an isolated promontory on the shores of Lake Nahuel Huapi, surrounded by dense forest that made approach by land nearly impossible without being seen. It had its own dock, its own power generation from a small hydroelectric system, and walls thick enough to be called fortified. Erich Priebke, the SS captain, had lived nearby and was known to visit the property regularly. Other Nazi fugitives were rumoured to have stayed there over the years. Local residents remembered German men arriving by boat at odd hours, staying for days or weeks, then disappearing. But ownership records for Inalco House were deliberately obscured. The property changed hands multiple times, always to shell companies registered in Paraguay or Uruguay, or to foreign trusts that were impossible to trace. When Eamon travelled to see the property in person, he found it still standing but abandoned, falling into decay. The gates were chained shut, the windows broken, weeds growing up through cracks in the courtyard. A sign warned of structural instability and ordered trespassers away. But Eamon wasn't deterred. He returned at night, climbed the fence, and explored the property with a flashlight. What he found was extraordinary. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, with rooms leading to other rooms in a maze-like configuration. The furniture had long since been removed, but you could see where expensive fixtures had been torn out, where wallpaper had covered rooms that must have been luxurious. In the basement, he found evidence of sophisticated security, bars on windows that were already below ground level, reinforced doors, what appeared to be a panic room with walls thick enough to stop bullets. And he found something else. A hidden door behind a false wall in what appeared to have been a wine cellar. The door led to a narrow staircase going down, deeper into the earth. Eamon descended carefully, his flashlight beam bouncing off stone walls that wet moisture. At the bottom was a room, maybe 15 feet by 20, with no windows and only the single entrance. The walls were covered with remnants of soundproofing material, rotting now but clearly visible. There were bolt holes in the floor where furniture had once been secured, and on one wall, scratched into the stone with something sharp, were German words. Wo ist meine Rettung? Where is my rescue? Eamon photographed everything, his heart pounding. This was a cell or a hiding place, or both. A room designed to keep someone concealed deep underground where they couldn't be found by search parties or satellite surveillance. A room where someone had waited, perhaps for years, living in isolation while the world above forgot they existed. He climbed back up and searched the rest of the house more carefully. In what must have been an office, he found something even more significant. Architectural blueprints rolled up and forgotten in a closet. The blueprints, dated 1947 and labelled Renovations and Security Upgrades, showed the house's floor plan. On the official blueprints filed with the municipality, there was a standard basement. But someone had made handwritten notations in the margins of these copies, in German, referencing a gesicherte Unterebene, secured sublevel, that wasn't shown in the official plans. One notation, written in faded pencil and barely legible, read, Geschützter Gast 48 bis 54. Protected Guest, 48 to 54, 1948 to 1954, a 6-year period when someone requiring protection lived in a secret basement beneath a mansion in Bariloche, Argentina. Eamon carefully rolled up the blueprints and took them with him. This was evidence, real evidence that someone of importance had been hidden in this house during those years. But who? The notation said protected guest, which could mean anyone, except combined with everything else he had found, the pattern was impossible to ignore. As he climbed back over the fence and walked to his rental car, Eamon didn't notice the vehicle parked down the road with its lights off, didn't see the 2 men inside watching him with night vision equipment, didn't realise that his investigation had just triggered alarms in circles that still, decades later, wanted certain secrets to remain buried. But he was about to find out. A-Seat 4, the witnesses who never spoke. Finding documentary evidence was one thing. Finding witnesses was another, and infinitely more challenging. By 2019, 74 years after the war's end, almost everyone who could have known the truth was dead. The generation that lived through the 1940s was gone, taking their secrets with them. But Eamon discovered that a few people had left behind statements, testimonies, and deathbed confessions that were either ignored or suppressed at the time, dismissed as the confused memories of the elderly or the attention-seeking lies of people trying to make themselves seem important. The first was Adelheid Schultz, and her story consumed weeks of Eamon's investigation. Schultz was a German nurse who had worked with the SS Medical Corps during the war, stationed at various locations including a field hospital on the Eastern Front. She was 36 years old when the war ended, and like many Germans with compromising pasts, she fled to South America rather than face denazification proceedings in occupied Germany. She arrived in Argentina in 1947 and settled in Bariloche, where she ran a small clinic serving the local German community. By all accounts, she was a skilled nurse and well-liked, though she rarely spoke about her past. She died in 1968 at the age of 62 from cancer, and it was only in her final days that she made statements that should have attracted more attention. Before she died, Schultz met with a Catholic priest, Father Miguel Serrano, to make her final confession. Serrano was an elderly Spanish priest who served Bariloche's small Catholic community, and who had a reputation for being discreet and understanding with his German parishioners, many of whom carried guilt for their wartime activities. Serrano kept written records of significant confessions, a practice that was technically against church doctrine, but not uncommon among older priests who wanted to document potential historical importance or who felt certain truths needed to be preserved. His journals were extensive, covering decades of service, and they'd been stored in the church basement after his death in 1993. Eamon found these journals during his time in Bariloche, guided there by Carlos Villanueva, whose grandfather had rented the house to Hans Bauer. Carlos mentioned that his grandmother had been friends with Adelheid Schultz, and that Schultz had made some kind of dramatic confession before dying. Carlos suggested the priest's journals might still exist somewhere. It took Eamon days of searching church records and speaking with elderly parishioners before he found the journals in a damp basement room filled with the old records. Most were mundane, recording baptisms, marriages, confessions of ordinary sins, but the entry dated October 7th, 1968, 2 days before Schultz's death, was extraordinary. Eamon photographed the entire entry, written in Father Serrano's careful handwriting. Adelheid Schultz came to me today for what I believe will be her final confession. She is dying, in great pain but also in great distress, about events she has kept secret for many years. I have never recorded specific confessions before, but I believe this testimony is of historical significance and may need to be known after her death. Adelheid confessed to providing medical care for a man she identified as the man with the moustache, a phrase she used repeatedly and that I understood to refer to Adolf Hitler, former leader of the German Reich. She said he lived under protection in the Bariloche area from 48 until the mid-50s, though she was uncertain of exact dates as she was instructed never to write anything down or keep records. She described providing treatment for various ailments. The man suffered from Parkinson's symptoms, tremors in his left hand that worsened over the years she treated him. He had chronic digestive issues, severe enough that he followed a strict vegetarian diet. He suffered from chronic anxiety and insomnia, requiring medication that Adelaide had to obtain through connections to doctors in Buenos Aires, who did not question what the prescriptions were for. She said he rarely left the property where he stayed, which she described as a house on the lake with many rooms underground. She was brought there by car with covered windows so she could not identify the exact location, though she believed it was within an hour's drive of Bariloche. The man was guarded by former SS men, whom she recognised by their bearing, and occasionally by actual recognition of their faces from her time with the medical corps. She said the man was unmistakably the Führer, despite being aged and weakened. She described his moustache, his eyes, his manner of speaking, all matching her memories of newsreels and photographs. He spoke to her only in German, sometimes rambled about the war and how history would vindicate him, sometimes sat in silence for entire sessions staring at the mountains visible through a window. When I asked why she was revealing this now, Adelheid said, "Because he's dead. They're all dead or dying. The guards, the ones who arranged everything, even the president who protected them. And someone should know the truth before we're all gone, and it becomes just another legend that no one can prove. I know what I saw, I know who I treated, and I want God to forgive me for keeping it secret. But I was afraid for my family, afraid of what they would do if I spoke." She died 2 days later. I do not know if her testimony is true, but I believe she believed it was true. Whether it was truth or the confused memories of a dying woman, I cannot say, but I've recorded it here as she told it to me. Eamon read the entry 3 times, his hands shaking. This was testimony, direct testimony, from someone who claimed to have treated Hitler in Argentina. Skeptics would dismiss it as unreliable. The memories of a dying woman, possibly confused or delusional. But the details were so specific, the medical descriptions so precise, that it was hard to dismiss entirely. And there was something about the way Father Serrano had recorded it, noting his own skepticism, but still finding it significant enough to document, that gave it weight. But one witness, even a detailed testimony, wasn't enough. Eamon needed more, and he found it in an unlikely place: the FBI. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had investigated claims that Hitler escaped to South America. This wasn't speculation or conspiracy theory. It was documented fact, available to anyone who filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the relevant files. In 2014, the FBI released hundreds of pages of declassified documents showing that agents had followed up on numerous reports of Hitler sightings in Argentina throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. Eamon obtained these files and spent days reading through them in his Buenos Aires apartment. Most of the reports were clearly false, obviously mistaken identity or deliberate hoaxes. People saw men with moustaches and reported them as Hitler, or people who disliked their German neighbours made anonymous tips hoping to cause trouble. But some reports were disturbingly specific and came from credible witnesses. One file documented the testimony of a former German naval officer named Helmuth Greiner, who was living in Buenos Aires in 1947. Greiner contacted the FBI's legal attaché in Buenos Aires and claimed to have seen Hitler at a remote estate near Bariloche. Greiner provided physical descriptions that matched Hitler, details about security arrangements including armed guards and restricted access, and even sketched a map of the property showing a large house on a promontory overlooking a lake. FBI agents investigated but concluded the lead was unverifiable. Reading between the lines of the report, Eamon could see that the agents had tried to visit the property Greiner described, but were turned away by Argentine authorities who claimed it was private property belonging to a diplomat and thus not subject to search. The FBI had no jurisdiction in Argentina and couldn't pursue it further. Another file documented testimony from an Argentine businesswoman named Isabella Ruiz, who reported in 1951 that she had met someone who looked exactly like the former German leader at a private party in San Carlos de Bariloche. The party was held at the German Cultural Centre, attended by perhaps 40 people, mostly wealthy German expatriates. Ruiz was there as the guest of a German businessman she was dating. She described the man as being in his 60s, with a distinctive moustache, deep-set eyes, and an authoritative manner despite appearing ill. He spoke German and was accompanied by two younger men who she assumed were relatives or caretakers, but who watched the room constantly like bodyguards. He was introduced only as Hans, with no last name given. Ruiz said the other Germans at the party treated him with unusual deference, almost reverence, in a way that struck her as odd. The FBI files show that agents had interviewed Ruiz and found her credible, noting she had no reason to fabricate such a story, and was actually reluctant to come forward because she feared damaging her relationship with the German community where she did business. But again, the investigation hit a dead end when Argentine authorities declined to cooperate in identifying the man Ruiz described. There were dozens of similar reports, each individually unverifiable, but collectively painting a picture of someone matching Hitler's description, living in the Bariloche area, under protection during the late 1940s and early 50s. The FBI files showed these investigations were taken seriously, at least initially. But by the mid-1950s, the Bureau seemed to lose interest. The official conclusion was that Hitler had died in Berlin, and that the sightings were cases of mistaken identity, deliberate hoaxes, or the delusions of people who wanted to believe Hitler had escaped. But when Eamon obtained the files through his university's legal department using FOIA requests, he noticed something disturbing. Several pages had sections that were not just redacted with black marks, which was normal for declassified documents where names or sensitive information needed to be protected, but physically cut out of the documents before they were scanned. Entire paragraphs had been removed with scissors or a razor blade, leaving rectangular holes in the pages. This wasn't standard declassification procedure. This was destruction of evidence. Someone had gone through these files before they were scanned and released and had physically removed specific information. What had those sections contained? What information was so sensitive that it had to be physically destroyed rather than simply redacted with black ink like everything else? Eamon would never know. But the pattern was clear. Someone had gone to great lengths to remove specific details from these files. Details that might have proven that witnesses had described a man matching Hitler's exact physical description, living in Argentina, years after his supposed death. And there was one more witness, perhaps the most disturbing of all, Carlos Villanueva, whose grandfather had rented the house to Hans Bauer, agreed to speak with Eamon at length about what his grandfather had said over the years. They met at Carlos's home in Bariloche, a comfortable house filled with family photographs spanning generations. Carlos was 74, a retired schoolteacher with clear memories of his grandfather, who had died when Carlos was 20. His grandfather, Enrique Villanueva, had owned several rental properties in the Bariloche area and had been relatively wealthy by local standards. Mi abuelo rented to many Germans, Carlos explained in Spanish as Eamon recorded the conversation. After the war, there were so many coming here. Some were just regular people looking for a fresh start, but some, everyone knew they were former Nazis. No one talked about it. It was just understood. You didn't ask questions about what they did in the war. Carlos described how his grandfather had rented a house on the outskirts of town to a man named Hans Bauer in 1947. Bauer paid 6 months' rent in advance, always in cash, always exact amounts. He rarely came to town. When he did, he wore a wide-brimmed hat and dark glasses even on overcast days. My abuelo said the German in the lake house never aged, Carlos told Eamon. He looked 60 years old in 1947 when he moved in, and he still looks 60 in 1954 when he left. My abuelo joked that maybe he had good genes or maybe he was sick and that's why his face looked like that. But he always said there was something off about the man. Carlos pulled out an old photograph from a box of family pictures. It showed his grandfather standing in front of a small house surrounded by trees, taken sometime in the 1950s based on the style and quality. Carlos pointed to a figure barely visible in the background, standing in the doorway of the house. That's the house he rented to Bauer, Carlos said, and that's Bauer in the door. My abuelo took this picture for property records, and he didn't realise until he developed it that Bauer was standing there. Eamon leaned close to examine the photograph. The figure was distant, features not entirely clear, but you could make out a man in dark clothing, a certain posture, and yes, what might be a moustache. "Can I photograph this?" Eamon asked. Carlos hesitated. "My family doesn't like to talk about this. When I was young, my mother told me never to mention the German renter. She said it could cause trouble for the family, but everyone involved is dead now. Maybe it's time the truth came out, whatever that truth is." Carlos let Eamon photograph the picture, and also shared more details about Hans Bauer's time in the house. The house was isolated, accessible only by a dirt road that was barely maintained. Bauer always had at least 2 other men living with him, younger men who Carlos's grandfather described as strong like soldiers. They would come to town occasionally to buy supplies, always paying cash, never engaging in conversation beyond necessary exchanges. Local people noticed the house because it didn't fit the pattern of other German expatriate homes. Most Germans in Bariloche were social, joining clubs, attending church, building community. But Bauer and his household were completely isolated, never attending events, never joining organisations, maintaining no social connections. There was another strange thing, Carlos said. Sometimes there would be visitors. Cars would arrive late at night, expensive cars from Buenos Aires based on the plates. Men in suits would go into the house and stay for hours, then leave before dawn. My abuelo saw this a few times when he would go fishing early in the morning and his route took him past the property. "Did your grandfather ever talk to these visitors?" Eamon asked. "No. He said they were government men, and you didn't ask government men questions if you knew what was good for you." Hans Bauer left the property abruptly in August 1954. He paid 6 months' rent in advance, in cash as always, and told Carlos's grandfather he would be relocating but provided no forwarding address. The house was left empty, and when the landlord finally entered it weeks later, he found it had been meticulously cleaned. Not a single personal item remained. Every surface had been scrubbed. The fireplace had been cleaned out so thoroughly that there wasn't even ash remaining. It was like he'd never been there, Carlos said. Except my abuelo found one thing. In a crack in the basement floor, someone had hidden a small piece of paper, folded many times to make it tiny. The paper had a German phrase written on it. "Sie werden nie die Wahrheit erfahren." They will never know the truth. Act 5. The identity switch. One of the most persistent questions about Hitler's alleged survival was simple but fundamental. If he didn't die in the bunker, whose body did the Soviets find? If the remains in the garden were not Hitler's, then whose were they? And how did they come to be identified as the Führer's? The answer might lie in one of the Third Reich's most disturbing programs, one that was historically documented and that created possibilities that seemed like something out of a spy thriller, but were actually real. The use of body doubles. Hitler had long been paranoid about assassination. This paranoia was not unfounded. There were numerous documented attempts on his life throughout his time in power, including the famous July 20th, 1944 bomb plot that nearly killed him. Throughout the war, he employed several men who resembled him physically, and were trained to mimic his mannerisms, speech patterns and appearance. These doubles would occasionally appear at public events or travel in his motorcade to confuse potential assassins. The existence of these doubles was not secret. They were photographed, documented by the Gestapo, and well known to Allied intelligence. One of the most famous was Gustav Wehler, a German soldier who bore a striking resemblance to Hitler and was photographed by Soviet forces after the fall of Berlin. Wehler's fate after the war was unclear, and some theories suggested he might have been one of the bodies found in the bunker complex. Eamon spent days researching the double program and found it more extensive than he'd realised. The SS had maintained files on men throughout Germany who resembled Hitler, cataloguing them as potential replacements for public appearances. Some knew they were being considered as doubles. Others had no idea their photographs were in Gestapo files marked Führer Resemblance Program. Could one of these doubles have been the burned body in the bunker garden? It was possible, even plausible. The remains were badly charred, making visual identification impossible. The Soviets relied on dental records, but those records were problematic from the start, and became more problematic the more Eamon researched them. Hitler's dentist, Hugo Blaschke, was captured by the Americans, not the Soviets, which meant the Russians had to rely on secondary sources for dental information. Blaschke's assistant, Käthe Häusermann, who had more direct knowledge of Hitler's dental work, was captured by Soviet investigators and interrogated for weeks. She identified bridgework and dental structures that she said belonged to Hitler. But Häusermann was held in Soviet captivity for years, imprisoned without trial, interrogated repeatedly, sometimes under duress. Years later, after her release in the mid-1950s, she made statements suggesting she had been pressured to confirm identifications she wasn't entirely certain about. In interviews late in her life, she admitted that the pressure to provide definitive answers had been intense, and that she'd been shown dental remains under conditions that made careful analysis difficult. And there was another problem, one that nagged at historians who looked closely at the evidence. The dental reports changed over time. The first Soviet report on Hitler's remains, issued in May 1945, just days after the bunker was captured, described one set of dental features. A second report from 1946 described different features, including dental work that didn't match the initial descriptions. A third report from 1968, when the Soviets finally admitted publicly that they had Hitler's remains, described yet another set of features. How could the same body have three different sets of dental characteristics? The only explanations were that the Soviets had mixed up multiple sets of remains, that they were lying about what they had found, or that different investigators had examined different bodies thinking they were all Hitler. None of these explanations inspired confidence in the official Soviet account. Eamon found a possible answer in the diary of a German dentist named Klaus Richter. Richter had practiced in Berlin during the war and fled to Argentina in 1947, part of the wave of Germans escaping Allied occupation. He died in Cordoba in 1983 at the age of 74, and his diary was donated to a local historical society by his daughter, who thought it might have value as a primary source document about life in wartime Berlin. Most of the diary was unremarkable, day-to-day accounts of his dental practice, complaints about shortages of materials, descriptions of air raids, and the growing sense of doom as the Red Army approached. But one entry, dated April 28, 1945, just 2 days before Hitler's supposed death, was extraordinary. Richter wrote, "Visited today by 2 SS officers, Sturmbannführer rank, names not given. They brought with them a man, unconscious, who bore remarkable resemblance to the Führer. They explained that this man had been injured in an air raid and required emergency dental work. They showed me dental records and x-rays and instructed me to make this man's dental work match those records exactly. I protested that this was unethical, that modifying a man's teeth to match someone else's records was fraud and potentially dangerous to the patient. The officers became threatening. They implied that refusal would result in consequences for myself and my family. They said this was a matter of higher state security and that I would understand later why it was necessary. I refused. I told them I would not participate in whatever deception they were planning. The officers became angry but eventually left, taking the unconscious man with them. I do not know what became of him, or whether they found another dentist willing to do what I refused. I fear what this means. If they are creating a body double with matching dental records, it can only be for the purpose of deception at the highest level. I must leave Berlin immediately. Richter's entry ended there. The next entry was dated May 5th, describing his escape from Berlin in the chaos of the Soviet occupation. The entry raised a horrifying possibility. What if the dental work the Soviets found wasn't Hitler's at all, but modifications made to a double's teeth to match Hitler's records? What if someone else died in that bunker, either willingly as a final service to the Führer or unwillingly as a sacrificial offering to create the illusion of Hitler's death? It sounded like something out of a thriller novel, like a plot too elaborate to be real. But in the chaos of Berlin's final days, with SS officers desperate to help their leader escape, with the resources of an entire state apparatus at their disposal, even as that state collapsed, would such a plan have been beyond possibility? Eamon didn't know, but the more he researched, the more he realised that the physical evidence for Hitler's death was far weaker than most people assumed. The dental records were contradictory and based on testimony from people under Soviet control. The skull fragment that supposedly proved the case turned out to belong to a woman. The eyewitness testimony came from a handful of people who were in the bunker under tremendous stress and who gave conflicting accounts. There was no definitive proof. There was only a story that everyone accepted because the alternative was too disturbing to consider, and because reopening the question would mean admitting that one of history's most important moments might be based on a lie. But what if it was a lie? What if the body in the garden was a double, carefully prepared with matching dental work, burned beyond recognition, and presented to the Soviets as Adolf Hitler? What if the real Hitler had slipped away in the chaos, hidden in a vehicle or led through the bunker's labyrinthine passages to an exit no one was watching? It was possible. Not certain, not proven, but possible. And that possibility, combined with everything else Eamon had found, made the scenario of escape seem less like fantasy and more like plausible alternative history. Act 6. The final years. If Hitler had escaped to Argentina, what happened to him there? How long did he live? Where did he ultimately die? And why did no one ever find him? These questions drove Eamon's investigation into its final, most dangerous phase. Because what he was about to discover would put him in the crosshairs of people who had spent decades ensuring these secrets stayed buried. The man known in Bariloche as Hans Bauer had lived in the rented house from 1947 to 1954, but his story didn't end when he left that property. Eamon began tracing what happened next, using property records, immigration documents, and interviews with elderly residents who remembered the German community from that era. 1954 was a significant year in Argentine history. Juan Perón's government was beginning to collapse. Political opposition was mounting, and the military was growing restless with Perón's increasingly authoritarian rule and erratic economic policies. By September 1955, Perón would be overthrown in a military coup and forced into exile. Many of the Nazis living under Perón's protection fled during this period, either deeper into Patagonia, to Paraguay, or to other countries. They recognized that whoever came after Perón might not be as friendly to their presence, might even cooperate with international efforts to prosecute war criminals. Eamon found evidence that Hans Bauer was part of this exodus. In the Argentine Interior Ministry archives, buried in a box of unsorted documents from the Perón era, was a transportation manifest dated August 19, 1954. The manifest listed special cargo being moved via military helicopter from Bariloche to an unspecified location in Sector Andino Sur, the southern Andes sector. The manifest included no names, just reference numbers, but it noted maximum security protocol and priority 1 classification, and was signed by an Interior Ministry official who reported directly to Peron himself. Eamon cross-referenced the date with other documents and found something interesting. August 19th, 1954 was the same date as the memo he'd found earlier, the one that mentioned primary asset moved to Location Condor. Location Condor. Eamon had been trying to identify what that meant for weeks, and finally he found a clue in an unlikely source. A travel book about Patagonia published in 1962 by an Argentine outdoorsman named Roberto Sanchez. The book, Hidden Valleys of the Andes, was mostly about hiking trails and camping spots, but it included a curious section about places that were off-limits to travellers. One passage caught Eamon's attention. In the remote reaches of the southern Andes, there are valleys that appear on no maps and roads that lead to nowhere official. During my expeditions in the late 1950s, I heard rumours from local gauchos about a compound deep in what they called the Condor Valley, named for the large number of Andean condors that nested in the cliffs nearby. The gauchos said German men lived there in a fortified building, men who did not welcome visitors, and who had the protection of the military. I attempted to locate this valley during an expedition in 1960, but was turned back by an army patrol that claimed the area was restricted for military exercises. I have marked this region on my map with a question mark, as it remains one of Patagonia's unsolved mysteries. The book included hand-drawn maps. Eamon found the one showing the Condor Valley region, though Sanchez had admitted he'd never actually seen it. The location was deep in the Andes, at least 50 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by helicopter or by a treacherous mountain road that was impassable much of the year due to snow. Eamon tried to locate Condor Valley on modern satellite maps, but found nothing. The area was part of a national park, largely wilderness, with no roads or settlements visible from above. But the terrain was rugged enough that a compound hidden in a valley might not be visible from satellite imagery, especially if it had been built to be concealed. If Hans Bauer had been moved to Condor Valley in 1954, it would explain why sightings of him in Bariloche stopped after that date. It would explain why FBI investigations in the mid-50s had turned up nothing. He'd been moved to a location so remote that even if someone knew generally where to look, finding him would be nearly impossible. But how long had he stayed there? And when did he finally die? Eamon found hints of the answer in an unexpected place. Among the documents he'd photographed from Father Serrano's journals was a mention of a request he'd received in February 1962. A man had come to the church in Bariloche, speaking German, asking for a priest willing to travel to a remote location to administer last rites to a dying man. Father Serrano had agreed, thinking it was a wealthy German landowner in an isolated estancia. He'd been picked up by car, driven for several hours with the windows covered so he couldn't identify the route, and brought to what he described as a monastery of German monks in the high mountains. The dying man, whom Father Serrano didn't name in his journal, was very old, very ill, and surrounded by men who were clearly guards rather than monks despite their religious robes. Father Serrano administered last rites, stayed for several hours while the man died, and was then driven back to Bariloche, again with covered windows. He noted that the experience had disturbed him, that something about the situation felt wrong, but he'd honoured his vows of confidentiality and never reported it to anyone. The entry was dated February 15th, 1962. This matched something Eamon would find later in the monastery, but we'll get to that. The pattern was becoming clearer. Hans Bauer, whoever he really was, had lived in Bariloche from 1947 to 1954 under the protection of Peron's government. When that protection became uncertain due to political instability, he'd been moved to a more secure location, the alleged Condor Valley compound, where he'd lived until at least 1962. If this man was Hitler, and Eamon was increasingly convinced he was, Then he'd survived in hiding for 17 years after his supposed death. 17 years watching the world move on, watching Germany be divided and rebuilt, watching the Holocaust's full horror be revealed at Nuremberg, watching new wars and new crises replace the one he'd started. 17 years as a ghost, a man who was supposed to be dead, living in silent isolation while history forgot him. And then, in 1962, at approximately age 73, he'd finally died. Not in glory, not in battle, not in any way that matched his grandiose vision of destiny, but quietly, in a monastery in the mountains, attended by a priest who didn't even know who he was giving last rites to. If Eamon was right, it was a pathetic end for a man who'd nearly conquered Europe, but it would also mean that one of history's greatest monsters had escaped justice, had lived in comfortable exile while his victims could never escape the consequences of his actions. The thought made Eamon angry. If this was true, if Hitler had escaped, then the entire post-war narrative was built on a lie. Justice had not been served. Evil had not been punished. The monster had gotten away. And that meant someone needed to know the truth, no matter how disturbing it was. Act 7. The cover-up. The deeper Eamon dug, the more resistance he encountered. And not just from the distant past, not just from sealed archives and missing documents, from the present. From people who were watching him, following him, warning him to stop. It started small. Documents that should have been available in the Buenos Aires archives were suddenly checked out or misplaced when Eamon requested them. Archive clerks who had been helpful became evasive, unable to meet his eyes. One clerk, an older woman named Maria, who'd helped him find several key documents, pulled him aside one afternoon and whispered urgently, "Stop asking about the Germans. Someone came here yesterday asking about you, asking what you've been researching. They showed government identification but wouldn't say which agency. They requested copies of all your document requests. I'm not supposed to tell you this, but you should be careful." Then his apartment in Buenos Aires was broken into. Nothing was stolen, which somehow made it worse than if it had been a normal burglary. His laptop was still there, his camera, his wallet with cash in it. But his papers had been disturbed, carefully rifled through. His research notes had been photographed. He could tell because they weren't quite in the same order he had left them. And on his desk, someone had left a photocopy of his passport photo, with a red X drawn through his face. The message was clear. We know who you are, we know what you're researching, and we can get to you whenever we want. Eamon reported it to the police, but they were dismissive. Nothing stolen, no visible damage, probably just kids looking for money and leaving when they didn't find any. The officer taking his report didn't even seem interested in the marked passport copy, suggesting Eamon had done it himself for attention. Then the warnings became explicit. He received an email from an anonymous account, no profile information, sent through an encrypted service that made tracing impossible. The message was simple. Stop reading. Some ghosts are meant to stay buried. He reported it to local police, who told him it was probably a prank from someone who'd seen his academic profile online. But Eamon knew better. Someone was threatened by his investigation, and that someone had resources. He began to wonder if the cover-up, if that's what it was, extended beyond Argentina. Had other governments been involved in hiding the truth? Had there been an international decision to let certain secrets remain secret? The answer, he discovered, was almost certainly yes. In the declassified CIA files released in the 1990s and 2000s, files that Eamon obtained through academic channels and FOIA requests, there were scattered references to Nazi fugitives in South America. The CIA had monitored these men, tracked their movements, and in some cases even recruited them for intelligence work during the Cold War. Nazi scientists had been brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, a program that recruited German technical experts despite their wartime activities. The rationale was simple. If America didn't take them, the Soviets would. Morality took a backseat to Cold War competition, but the CIA's interest in Nazi fugitives seemed to end in the late 1950s, at least officially. After that, the agency's position was simple. These men were no longer a priority. The Cold War took precedence. Maintaining good relations with South American governments was more important than pursuing aging war criminals. Eamon found a memo from 1958 that made this policy explicit. The memo, written by a CIA station chief in Buenos Aires and addressed to CIA headquarters in Langley, recommended that termination of search efforts for remaining high-value Nazi targets be implemented. The reason given was brutally frank. South American stability takes priority over historical accountability. Continue monitoring but cease active investigation. In other words, the CIA knew there were still Nazi fugitives in Argentina, but pursuing them risked destabilizing governments that the United States needed as allies against communism. So the agency decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Could Hitler have been one of those sleeping dogs? Could the CIA have known he was alive and decided that the diplomatic complications of revealing it outweighed the value of bringing him to justice? It seemed impossible. The death of Adolf Hitler was one of the most significant events of the 20th century. Surely the CIA, MI6 and other intelligence agencies would have moved heaven and earth to confirm it or expose a hoax. But maybe not. Maybe, in the chaos of the Cold War's early years, with the Soviet Union emerging as the new existential threat, pursuing an aging, powerless fugitive in a remote corner of Argentina wasn't worth the diplomatic complications. Maybe they'd even seen value in Hitler remaining dead, in maintaining the narrative of justice served and evil punished, because reopening that question would undermine confidence in the post-war order. Eamon couldn't prove any of this, but the pattern of missing documents, sealed files and evasive official responses suggested something had been hidden. Not necessarily by one government or one agency, but by a collective decision across multiple nations to let certain truths remain buried. And someone, even now, 74 years after Hitler's supposed death, wanted to keep it that way. The surveillance became more obvious. Eamon noticed the same car parked near his apartment building multiple days in a row. 2 men sitting inside, not even trying to hide. When he went to the university library, the same men were there, sitting at different tables but always watching. He started taking precautions. He made copies of all his research, storing them in multiple locations, uploading encrypted files to cloud storage, mailing physical copies to trusted colleagues abroad. If something happened to him, he wanted the information to survive. His thesis advisor at the university called him in for a meeting. The conversation was uncomfortable from the start. Eamon, there have been complaints, concerns about the university's reputation. Some of your research requests have attracted attention from people who are influential with our funding sources. Influential how? Eamon asked. I can't say specifically, but I've been advised to suggest that perhaps you should consider focusing on a different topic, something less controversial, something that won't raise questions about the university's judgment in supporting your work. Are you telling me to stop my research? I'm telling you that your current line of inquiry is making people nervous. People who have the power to make life difficult for this program and for you personally. I'm advising you, as someone who cares about your future, to consider whether pursuing this topic is worth the consequences. It was a threat, politely worded but unmistakable. Continue investigating and face professional consequences. Drop it and your academic career continues normally. Eamon realised that his investigation had reached a point where powerful people, whoever they were, wanted him to stop. They'd tried subtle warnings. They'd tried breaking into his apartment. Now they were applying institutional pressure. But he was too close to quit. He had one more lead to follow, one more place to search. If he was going to be forced to stop, he wanted to find the final piece of evidence first. The monastery of San Juan de la Cruz. Father Serrano's journals had mentioned it. Carlos Villanueva had said his grandfather spoke of monks keeping German secrets. And Eamon had found a reference in Argentine church records to a Benedictine monastery in the southern Andes that had been founded by German monks in the 1920s and that had remained closed to visitors for decades. If the protected guest had been moved from Condor Valley to a more secure location as he aged and became ill, a monastery would be perfect. Isolated, self-contained, protected by religious privilege, and staffed by people loyal to a shared ethnic and possibly ideological background. Eamon knew it was a risk. If the surveillance was as serious as it seemed, going to the monastery would make him vulnerable. But he'd come this far, he couldn't stop now. He made arrangements to visit, claiming to be researching Catholic missions in Patagonia for his dissertation. And on a cool morning in late October, he drove into the mountains, following directions that took him further from civilization with every kilometre. What he found there would either vindicate everything he believed or prove he'd been chasing shadows. But either way, he was about to reach the end of his investigation. Because the people watching him had decided that the monastery was where his investigation would end, one way or another. Ending. The truth he cannot prove. The monastery of San Juan de la Cruz sat at the end of a winding mountain road, 3 hours from Bariloche, surrounded by pine forest and snow-capped peaks that rose like ancient sentinels into the pale sky. The road itself was barely maintained, more gravel and dirt than pavement, climbing through switchbacks that offered dizzying views of valleys dropping away thousands of feet below. Eamon drove slowly, his rental car struggling with the altitude and the grade. He passed no other vehicles, saw no signs of human habitation beyond the road itself, which looked like it was used rarely enough that grass grew in patches where the gravel had worn thin. The monastery appeared suddenly around a final curve. It was a stone building in the German style, almost like a small castle, with thick walls and narrow windows that suggested it had been built as much for defence as for prayer. A cross rose from a tower at one end, and smoke drifted from chimneys, the only sign of life. Eamon parked in a small courtyard and sat for a moment, his heart pounding. This was it. Whatever truth existed, it was here. He could feel it with a certainty that transcended logic. He got out of the car and approached the heavy wooden door. Before he could knock, it opened, and an elderly monk in traditional robes regarded him with eyes that were simultaneously kind and sad. "You're the researcher, yes? The one studying Catholic missions?" The monk spoke Spanish with a German accent. "Yes, I'm Eamon Weiss. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me, brother. Brother Klaus, please come in. We have been expecting you." The phrase sent a chill through Eamon. We have been expecting you. Not I, but we. As if his arrival was anticipated, as if preparations had been made. Brother Klaus led him through stone corridors lit by bare bulbs hanging from ancient fixtures. The monastery was old but maintained, with that particular quality of cleanliness and order that came from religious discipline. They passed a small chapel where several monks knelt in prayer, their murmured Latin echoing off stone walls. "You're interested in our history?" Brother Klaus asked as they walked. "Yes, the founding of German monasteries in Argentina, the role they played in the post-war period." Brother Klaus nodded slowly. "The post-war period. Yes, that is a complicated time. Many Germans came here seeking peace, seeking to escape the chaos of occupied Europe. We welcomed them. That is the Christian way, to offer sanctuary to those who seek it, even if they were fleeing justice rather than chaos." The monk stopped and turned to face Eamon. His expression was unreadable. "That is a question of perspective, young man. Who defines justice? The victors of a war? God? Each man's conscience? We welcome those who came to us in need. What they had done before, that was between them and God." Brother Klaus continued walking, leading Eamon to a small library where shelves held books in German, Latin and Spanish. "Our monastery keeps extensive records. Perhaps you would like to see them." "I would. Thank you." "Please, wait here. I will bring what you need." The monk left, and Eamon found himself alone in the library. He looked around at the books, noting religious texts but also historical works, biographies of German leaders, books about the Third Reich written in German. The collection suggested these monks maintained an interest in their homeland's history even in exile. Brother Klaus returned with a folder of documents. These are records from our founding through the 1960s. Baptisms, deaths, visitors we received. Perhaps they will be useful for your research. Eamon began looking through the folder, seeing exactly what Brother Klaus had described. Mundane records of monastery life. He was about to thank the monk and ask if there were other archives when he noticed something odd about the folder itself. It was the right size for what it contained, but when he felt the bottom, there was a slight irregularity, as if something was hidden underneath the visible documents. He looked at Brother Klaus, who was watching him with that same expression of kindness mixed with sadness. Brother Klaus, I'm not really here to research Catholic missions. I think you know that. The monk was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Yes, I suspected as much. Your questions were too specific, too focused. You are seeking something else. I'm seeking the truth about what happened here, about who was protected here. Brother Klaus sat down heavily in a chair, suddenly looking his full age, which Eamon guessed was well into his 80s. I have prayed for guidance about what to do when someone like you came, because I knew eventually someone would. The truth cannot stay buried forever, no matter how many people wish it would. Then you'll help me? I will show you what exists, but I cannot protect you from the consequences of knowing. There are those who believe some truths are too dangerous, too destabilizing. They have protected these secrets for a very long time, and they will not be happy that the secrets are revealed. I understand the risk. Brother Klaus looked at him for a long moment, then made a decision. Come with me. What you seek is not in this library. It is below. He led Eamon down a narrow stone staircase into the monastery's cellar, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder as they descended, and Eamon could smell the earth, damp stone, the scent of age. At the bottom was a single room, lined with shelves holding boxes of documents. Brother Klaus walked directly to one shelf and pulled down a box marked 1947 bis 1965, 1947 to 1965. This box contains records that were never supposed to be kept, Brother Klaus said. But Brother Heinrich, who was our abbot during those years, believed that history must be documented even when that documentation is dangerous. He kept these records in secret, and only a few of us knew they existed. He handed the box to Eamon. I must pray now. I will leave you here to examine these documents. Take what time you need. Brother Klaus, why are you showing me this? Why not destroy it or keep it hidden? The old monk smiled sadly. Because I'm 86 years old, and when I die, which will be soon, these records will disappear. The other monks who knew about them are all dead now. I am the last. And I have decided that whatever sins were committed by keeping these secrets, they should not continue beyond my generation. The truth should be known, whatever consequences follow. God will judge whether I am right. He left Eamon alone in the cellar, and Eamon opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were records, written in neat German script by Brother Heinrich over many years. Eamon read through them, his heart pounding harder with each page. The records documented the arrival at the monastery in August 1954 of a man described only as guest of protection, transferred from southern location by authority of Interior Ministry. The guest was elderly, in poor health, suffering from Parkinson's disease and severe anxiety. He was accompanied by two men identified only as guardians, and was to be housed in the monastery's secure wing, attended by the monks, but isolated from any outside contact. The records covered 8 years, from 1954 to 1962. They described the guest's declining health, his increasing paranoia, his moments of lucidity when he would speak about history and his role in it. Brother Heinrich's notes were clinical but occasionally editorial. The guest spoke today of his certainty that history would vindicate him, that future generations would understand he had been right. I did not have the heart to tell him that history has already judged him a monster. Perhaps God will offer him understanding that human justice cannot. The final entry was dated February 12th, 1962. The guest died today after 3 days of unconsciousness. Father Serrano from Bariloche came to administer last rites. We will bury him in the monastery cemetery under the name he'd been using. May God have mercy on his soul, for men will not. Beneath Brother Heinrich's records were the documents Eamon had been seeking. A passport, Argentine, issued in 1953 under the name Kurt Olden. The photo showed an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with a thin moustache and deep-set eyes. The resemblance to Adolf Hitler was undeniable, even accounting for age and illness. Beneath the passport was a death certificate. Name, Kurt Olden. Date of death, February 12th, 1962. Course of death, cerebral hemorrhage. Place of death, San Juan de la Cruz Monastery. Attending physician, Brother Heinrich, trained medical practitioner. And finally, a photograph. It showed an elderly man sitting in a chair on a terrace, a blanket across his lap, looking out at a vista of mountains and lake. The mountains in the background were unmistakably the Andes. The lake was clearly Nahuel Huapi. The man in the photo looked frail and tired, but his face, even aged and weathered by years of illness, bore the features that billions of people around the world would instantly recognize. Eamon's hands trembled as he photographed everything with his phone, working quickly because he didn't know how much time he had. He photographed each page of Brother Heinrich's records, the passport from multiple angles, the death certificate, the photograph. The phone's camera shutter sound echoed in the stone cellar like a countdown. This was it. This was the proof. Not definitive, perhaps, because skeptics could always claim the documents were forged or the resemblance coincidental. But compelling enough to rewrite history, to force a re-examination of everything everyone thought they knew about how the war ended. He heard footsteps on the stairs, multiple sets of footsteps moving quickly. Brother Klaus appeared in the doorway, but he wasn't alone. 2 men in dark clothing stood behind him. The monk's face was pale, apologetic, frightened. "I'm sorry," Brother Klaus whispered. "I told them you were here. They called me last night and said that if you came to the monastery I was to notify them immediately. They said there would be consequences for the monastery if I did not comply. I am sorry. I am an old man and a coward. Please forgive me." The men moved quickly into the room. One of them grabbed Eamon's phone from his hands, checked the photos, and then smashed it on the stone floor with force that shattered it into pieces. The other seized the documents from Eamon's hands, the passport, the death certificate, the photograph, Brother Heinrich's records. "You've seen things you shouldn't have," one of the men said in Spanish, though his accent was strange, vaguely German, but not quite. "But you're going to forget what you saw. Do you understand?" Eamon's heart was pounding so hard he felt lightheaded. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The man stepped closer. "My colleague and I work for people who have spent 74 years making sure certain truths stayed buried. Those people have resources you cannot imagine, connections you cannot fight. If you speak about this, if you try to publish anything, if you even tell your friends over drinks, you will disappear. Not killed. That would create questions, investigations, attention. Just gone. Disappeared. No one will ever find you. Your family will spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened. Do you understand?" "Yes," Eamon managed to say. "Good. You're a smart young man. You have a promising career ahead of you. Don't throw it away chasing ghosts that the world has forgotten. The war ended 74 years ago. Everyone involved is dead. It doesn't matter anymore." "But it does matter," Eamon said, finding his voice. "The truth matters. History matters. If he escaped, if Hitler lived while his victims couldn't, that matters." The man's expression didn't change. "No, it doesn't. Because even if you proved it, what would change? Would it bring back the dead? Would it provide justice? Or would it just destabilize the comfortable narratives that people have built their understanding of history on?" "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the truth does more harm than good. Sometimes lies that bring peace are better than truths that bring chaos." He nodded to his colleague, who pulled a syringe from his jacket pocket. "What is that?" Eamon asked, fear flooding through him. "Nothing harmful. A sedative. You'll sleep for a few hours. When you wake up, you'll be in your apartment in Buenos Aires. Your rental car will be returned. Your belongings will be waiting for you. And you will forget about this investigation and go back to your normal academic work. Do you understand?" Eamon wanted to fight, to run, but the other man was holding his arm with a grip like iron. He felt the needle enter his vein, felt the cold rush of the drug entering his bloodstream. "Why?" he started to ask, but his tongue felt thick, his thoughts scattering like leaves in wind. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was one of the men speaking quietly to Brother Klaus. "The monastery's funding will continue. Your silence is appreciated. Destroy the remaining records in that box. This ends here." Then nothing. Eamon woke in his apartment. It was dark outside. His head throbbed. He was lying on his couch, fully dressed, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He sat up slowly, trying to piece together what had happened. The monastery, Brother Klaus, the documents, the men who took everything. He checked his pockets. His wallet was there. His keys. Everything normal except his phone was gone. On his coffee table was a new phone, identical model to his old one still in the packaging. A note was attached. "Your phone was damaged. Here is a replacement. We hope you will reconsider your research focus." Eamon's laptop was open on his desk. He checked his research files. Most were still there, but the documents he'd scanned at the monastery were gone. His cloud storage backups had been wiped. The physical copies he had mailed to colleagues. He would find out later that they never arrived, lost somewhere in international mail. Everything was gone. Every photograph of the documents, every piece of evidence, vanished as thoroughly as if it had never existed. For weeks afterward, Eamon debated what to do. He could tell his story. He could go public with what he'd seen. But without evidence, who would believe him? He'd be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, an academic whose research had driven him to seeing patterns where none existed. And there was the threat. Explicit. Credible. If he spoke out, he would disappear. He believed them. The men who took his evidence had resources and connections that made such a threat entirely plausible. His thesis advisor made it clear that any work on Nazi fugitives in Argentina would not be accepted. Choose a different topic, something less controversial, something that doesn't make enemies of powerful people. Eamon changed his thesis topic to immigration policy in post-war Argentina, keeping it general, avoiding the sensitive areas. He finished his degree. He took a teaching position at a small college in New England. He lived a quiet life, but he never stopped thinking about what he had found. Years later, in 2022, sitting in his office at the college, he recorded his final thoughts on the investigation. He didn't intend to publish them, didn't intend to share them widely, but he needed to document what he'd found, needed to put it into words even if no one else would ever hear them. The recording was found after his death on a hard drive in his desk drawer. History records Adolf Hitler dying in his bunker in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. The Soviets found remains. The world moved on. The war ended. Justice, such as it was served. But the documents I found suggest another story. A story of escape routes and U-boats, of Vatican assistance and Argentine protection, of a man who lived in hiding for 17 years, guarded and sheltered by those who still believed in him. I cannot prove this story is true. The evidence was taken from me. The witnesses are dead. The files are sealed or destroyed. But I know what I saw. I know what I held in my hands in that monastery cellar. I know the details I read in Brother Heinrich's careful handwriting. I know the face in the photograph, aged but unmistakable. And I know that someone, even now, 3 years after I found those documents, wants that truth to stay buried. Maybe they're right. Maybe some ghosts should stay buried. Maybe the world is better off believing that evil ended when Berlin fell. Or maybe the truth matters, no matter how disturbing. Maybe we owe it to history to ask the uncomfortable questions, to challenge the accepted narrative, to consider the possibility that what we think we know is not the whole story. I'll never know for certain. I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if the men who threatened me were protecting a real secret or just trying to suppress what they feared could be true. Wondering if Hitler really did escape, or if I saw what I wanted to see in documents that might have been elaborate forgeries planted to deceive researchers like me. And maybe someday someone else will find what I found. Someone braver than me. Someone who can bring the truth to light without fear of the consequences. Until then, the fourth exit remains a mystery. A door that might have existed, or might have been nothing more than desperate wishful thinking by men who couldn't accept that their Führer died like a coward in a concrete hole beneath a burning city. But I believe the door was real. I believe he walked through it, and I believe he lived long enough to see the world forget him, before finally dying in silence, far from the ruins he created. The recording ends there. Eamon Weiss never published his findings. He lived a quiet life, taught history to undergraduates, occasionally published minor papers on uncontroversial topics. He seemed content, or at least resigned. He died in March 2022 at the age of 43, from a sudden heart attack while jogging near his home. His doctor said it was unusual for someone his age and health, but heart attacks happen. There was no autopsy at the family's request, no investigation, just a death certificate and a quiet funeral. His files, what remained of them, were donated to his university's library as he'd specified in his will. But when researchers tried to access them, they found that most of the documents related to his time in Argentina were missing. The boxes were there, properly labelled, but when opened they contained only blank paper, thousands of blank sheets carefully stacked to give the impression of full document boxes. Someone had removed the contents and replaced them with blanks, recently based on the paper quality, perhaps after Eamon's death, perhaps shortly before. And the folder that started it all, the unmarked manila folder Eamon Weiss found in the Buenos Aires National Archives on that humid August afternoon in 2019. When another researcher requested it based on Eamon's citation notes, the archivist had no record of it. No catalogue number, no filing location, no record that it had ever existed. They suggested politely that perhaps Eamon had been mistaken about where he'd found it, or that he'd misremembered the contents. It was gone. No trace remained. The archivist had no explanation. Things go missing sometimes, one of them said with a shrug. Old documents, improperly filed, they fall apart or get misplaced during moves. It happens. But documents don't delete themselves from the catalogue system. They don't remove themselves from filing cabinets. Someone had gone into the archives and erased all evidence that the folder had ever been there. Some stories refuse to die. They linger in the margins of history, whispered in the dark, impossible to prove but equally impossible to completely dismiss. The fourth exit is one of those stories, a door that might have existed, a life that might have continued in secret, a truth that someone desperately wants to remain hidden. You can believe the official history. April 30th, 1945. The bunker. The body burned beyond recognition. The war's end. The monster destroyed. Justice served, however, imperfectly. Or you can wonder, because the documents existed at least for one afternoon in an archive reading room. The witnesses spoke, at least in private, before they died. The evidence, for a brief moment, was real enough to touch, to photograph, to hold in trembling hands. And then it vanished. Just like the man himself supposedly vanished on that April day in 1945, leaving behind only burned remains that might have been him or might have been someone else, dental records that changed with each telling, and a story everyone accepted because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. What if the alternative was true? What if the greatest criminal in history escaped justice and lived out his days in comfortable exile, dying peacefully in a monastery, while his victims had been given no such mercy. That would mean the entire post-war order was built on a lie. It would mean the narrative of justice and accountability was fiction. It would mean powerful people and institutions had conspired for decades to protect that lie. It would mean asking uncomfortable questions about who knew what, when they knew it, and why they chose to keep it secret. Maybe that's why the evidence disappeared. Maybe that's why Eamon Weiss died young from an unexpected heart attack. Maybe that's why anyone who gets too close to this truth finds themselves warned away or worse. Because some truths are too dangerous. Some doors should remain closed. Some ghosts should stay buried. Or maybe we're meant to wonder forever, caught between proof and doubt, between history and mystery, never quite certain what really happened in those final chaotic days when Berlin burned and the Third Reich collapsed and the most wanted man in the world supposedly took his own life, the fourth exit. If it existed, Adolf Hitler walked through it and vanished into legend. If it didn't, then we're chasing shadows, seeing patterns where none exist, believing in conspiracies because the truth is too mundane. But I know what Eamon Weiss saw in that monastery. I know what he recorded in his final statement, and I know that 3 years after finding those documents, he died under circumstances that were perhaps not as natural as they appeared. Draw your own conclusions, believe what you choose to believe, but remember that history is written by the victors, and sometimes the victors have reasons to protect certain lies. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most enduring mysteries, please leave a comment below. Let us know what you think. Did Hitler escape? Is it possible? Or is this just one more conspiracy theory in a world full of them? What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from? We love hearing from our global community. And don't forget to use those hype points if you want to support the channel. Every bit helps us keep bringing you these stories, these investigations into the dark corners of history where truth and legend blur together. Until next time, sleep well. Or try to. Because some ghosts never truly rest. And some truths, once uncovered, can never be entirely forgotten, no matter how many people try to bury them. The fourth exit. Real or imagined, it represents a question we may never definitively answer. But perhaps asking the question is enough. Perhaps keeping the mystery alive, refusing to accept easy answers, maintaining that healthy skepticism of official narratives, maybe that's how we honour both history and truth. Good night. And remember, the world is full of secrets. Some are meant to be discovered. Others are meant to destroy those who find them. The trick is knowing which is which before it's too late. Sleep well. Tonight we're diving into a story that will make you question everything you think you know about American history. But first, I want to thank Thundy308 for suggesting this story in the comments. Your ideas keep sleep theories alive. If you have video ideas of your own, drop them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these late night mysteries, please hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that blur the line between history and conspiracy. Most people don't know America was attacked long before 9/11. Hell, most people don't even know about Pearl Harbor beyond the Hollywood version. But I found out the hard way that our nation's first taste of domestic terrorism happened in 1916, right in New York Harbor. And the real story, it's so much worse than what they taught us in school. My name is irrelevant. Let's just say I'm someone who stumbles into things I shouldn't. 3 months ago, I was helping my grandmother clean out my grandfather's attic in Jersey City. Standard stuff. Old furniture, mouldy books, boxes of Christmas decorations from the 1970s. But tucked away in a corner, beneath a tarp that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades, I found a trunk. Not just any trunk. This thing was old. Really old. The kind of leather and brass construction they don't make anymore, with travel stickers from steamship lines that went out of business before my grandfather was born. The lock was broken, hanging loose like someone had forced it open years ago and never bothered to fix it. Inside, the air smelled of ash and time, burned papers, some so brittle they crumbled when I touched them, insurance ledgers with faded ink. And at the bottom, wrapped in what used to be white cloth, a letter dated July 31st, 1916, the day after the Black Tom explosion. The letter was signed by a man named Samuel Weiser, and he claimed to have witnessed something that, if true, would rewrite American history. He wrote about sabotage, but not the kind they told us about in history class. He wrote about American officials not just watching it happen, but helping it along. They wanted it to happen, the letter said in shaky handwriting. The blast was too perfect, too convenient, and I saw them, our own people, making sure those German boys got exactly where they needed to be. That was 3 months ago. I should have put the letter back, closed the trunk, and pretended I never found it. But curiosity killed more than just cats, and now I'm sitting here at 3 a.m, looking over my shoulder every few minutes, wondering if the same people who silenced Samuel Weiser in 1916 are coming for me next. This is my story. If something happens to me before I can tell it properly, at least it'll be out there. Someone needs to know the truth about Black Tom Island. Let me paint you a picture of what America looked like in 1916. World War I was raging across Europe, turning an entire continent into a muddy graveyard. Officially, the United States was neutral. Unofficially, we were making a fortune selling ammunition to Britain and France through a complex network of shell companies and dummy corporations. The centre of this operation was a place called Black Tom Island, though calling it an island was generous. It was more like a man-made peninsula jutting into New York Harbour, connected to Jersey City by a narrow causeway. From Manhattan you could see it clearly. Massive warehouses, railroad cars lined up like dominoes, and mountains of ammunition crates waiting to be loaded onto ships bound for European battlefields. On the night of July 30th, 1916, Black Tom Island held over 2 million pounds of ammunition. Dynamite, TNT, artillery shells, rifle cartridges, enough firepower to level half of Manhattan if it all went up at once. At 2:08 a.m. on July 30th it did exactly that. The first explosion shattered windows across lower Manhattan. The second, 30 minutes later, was so powerful it registered as a 5.5 earthquake on seismographs as far away as Philadelphia. Shrapnel embedded itself in the Statue of Liberty's torch arm. Clock towers in Jersey City stopped working, their mechanisms thrown out of alignment. People in Brooklyn thought it was the end of the world. The official story came together remarkably quickly. German saboteurs had infiltrated Black Tom Island and blown up the ammunition depot to prevent American weapons from reaching the Allies. Clean, simple, and perfectly designed to make Americans angry at Germany. But Samuel Weiser's letter told a different story. I was working the night shift, he wrote, checking manifests in the office overlooking the main causeway. Around midnight I saw them coming, 3 men in dark coats walking like they owned the place. But they weren't alone. 2 police officers were escorting them, not like prisoners, like guests. According to Weiser, he watched these 5 men walk directly to Warehouse 18, the largest ammunition storage facility on the island. The police officers had keys. They opened doors that should have been locked, disabled alarm systems that should have been active. The Germans, and they were Germans, I could tell by their accents when they talked to each other, they knew exactly where to go, like they had blueprints. The police officers didn't just let them work, they helped them carry the equipment. Weiser wrote that he watched for over an hour as this group systematically placed charges throughout the warehouse. When they finished, they all left together. The police officers drove the Germans away in an official police vehicle. 45 minutes later, Black Tom Island ceased to exist. I tried to tell people what I saw, Vaser's letter continued. The fire chief, the police captain, even a reporter from the Jersey Journal. But every time I opened my mouth, someone would pull me aside and suggest I must be mistaken, must have been confused by the darkness, the smoke, the chaos. After a few days, I stopped trying. After a few weeks, I realised I probably shouldn't have tried at all. The letter was dated July 31st, 1916. According to records I found later, Samuel Vaser disappeared on August 3rd, 1916. His body was never found. The insurance ledger was the second thing I found in that trunk, and honestly, it might have been more damning than Vaser's letter. Numbers don't lie, and these numbers told a story of their own. The ledger belonged to Northeastern Mutual Insurance, a company that specialised in maritime and industrial coverage. Page after page of entries, all dated between August 1916 and December 1917, all related to Black Tom Island claims. The payouts were staggering, not just for the physical damage, that was expected, but for what the insurance industry calls business interruption claims. Companies that had been shipping ammunition through Black Tom collected millions of dollars for lost revenue, cancelled contracts, damaged relationships with European buyers. But here's what caught my attention. The companies collecting the biggest payouts weren't small operations that got wiped out by the explosion. They were massive corporations that simply redirected their business through other ports. DuPont collected $2.1 million. Bethlehem Steel got $1.8 million. Remington Arms walked away with nearly $3 million. For context, $3 million in 1916 money is about $80 million today. These companies didn't just recover from Black Tom, they profited from it. I started cross-referencing the names in the ledger with newspaper archives from 1917 and 1918. The pattern was unmistakable. Every single company that collected major Black Tom insurance payouts had executives who publicly advocated for American entry into World War I. They weren't just war profiteers, they were war lobbyists. DuPont's president, Irénée Dupont, gave speeches about America's moral obligation to join the fight against German aggression. Bethlehem Steel's Charles Schwab met privately with President Wilson 6 times between the Black Tom explosion and America's declaration of war. Remington's board included 2 former congressmen who had voted against neutrality measures. The explosion that was supposedly an attack on American interests had made the people pushing for war incredibly wealthy, and they had been incredibly well insured against exactly the kind of attack that happened. I found myself staring at those numbers for hours, adding and re-adding the totals. Northeastern Mutual had paid out over $15 million in Black Tom claims, about $400 million in today's money, for a single incident. For a company that size, that should have meant bankruptcy. But Northeastern Mutual didn't go bankrupt. According to financial records I found online, 1917 was their most profitable year ever. Someone had backed those payouts, someone with deep pockets and deeper connections, someone who wanted those specific companies to have the capital they needed to ramp up war production. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that Samuel Vaser had been right. The blast was too perfect, too convenient. But it wasn't just German sabotage with American assistance. It was American sabotage with German patsies. Finding information about Samuel Vaser turned out to be like trying to catch smoke. The man had been systematically erased from public records. I started with the obvious places: birth certificates, marriage licenses, employment records. Jersey City Hall had a Samuel Vaser listed as employed by Black Tom Terminal from 1914 to 1916, but the file was incomplete. No address, no next of kin, no termination date. Just a note that said, employment ended August 1916. The Jersey Journal archives were more helpful, but in a way that made my skin crawl. I found 3 mentions of Samuel Vaser in the weeks following the Black Tom explosion. The first was in a list of witnesses being interviewed by federal investigators. The second was a brief quote in an article about the damage assessment, where he mentioned seeing unusual activity before the blast. The third mention was his obituary. Samuel Vaser, 34, dock worker, found deceased in Hudson River August 3rd, 1916. Cause of death listed as drowning. No known relatives. Services private. 12 words. Most people who die accidentally get more space than that, especially if they die in unusual circumstances, just days after being a witness to the biggest domestic attack in American history. But here's the thing that really bothered me. The obituary was dated August 4th, 1916, but it was printed on page 8 of the newspaper, buried between advertisements for patent medicines and notices about church socials. The Black Tom explosion was still front-page news, investigations were ongoing, and a key witness had just died mysteriously. You'd think that would warrant more than 12 words on page 8. I tried to find records of the investigation into Weiser's death. Police reports, coroner's findings, anything. Nothing. According to the Jersey City Police Department archives, there was no investigation. Samuel Weiser's death was ruled accidental drowning. Case closed, no follow-up required. A man who claimed to have witnessed American officials assisting German saboteurs was found dead in the Hudson River 4 days later, and nobody thought that was worth investigating. I found myself thinking about those police officers Weiser described, the ones with keys to the warehouses, the ones who escorted the Germans and then drove them away. If Weiser was telling the truth, those officers would have known he was watching from the office window. They would have seen the light, seen his silhouette against the glass. They would have known exactly who could identify them. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that Samuel Weiser hadn't drowned accidentally. He'd been silenced. And whoever silenced him had enough influence to make sure the investigation never happened. But Weiser had been smart enough to write that letter before they got to him. He'd documented what he saw, hidden it away, and hoped someone would eventually find it and ask the right questions. Someone like me. The problem was, if they had killed him for talking in 1916, what would they do to me for digging in 2023? The newspaper archives told a story of narrative manipulation that would make modern spin doctors proud. In the hours immediately following the Black Tom explosion, reporters had no idea what to write. The blast was unprecedented, the damage was massive, and nobody had any official explanation. So they wrote what they saw and what witnesses told them. The first newspaper accounts, published in evening editions on July 30th, described the explosion as an industrial accident of unprecedented scale. Reporters interviewed dock workers, nearby residents, anyone who had seen or heard something. The quotes were revealing. "It looked like the whole harbour was on fire," read Manhattan resident. "We heard 3 distinct explosions, not just one," Jersey City police officer. "There were people running from the island before the first blast, like they knew it was coming," Brooklyn dock worker who was looking across the water with binoculars. But within 48 hours the narrative began to change. A new explanation emerged, seemingly from nowhere. German saboteurs. Articles started focusing on German spies, German plots, the German threat to American neutrality. Witness accounts that didn't fit this narrative simply disappeared from follow-up stories. I found draft articles in the archives of the New York Tribune that were never published. One reporter had interviewed a Black Tom security guard who claimed to have seen men in police uniforms acting suspicious on the night of the explosion. The article was pulled before publication, replaced with a piece about German espionage networks. Another unpublished draft described mysterious ships seen in the harbour before the explosion, ships that left immediately after the blast without offering assistance to rescue efforts. That story was replaced with speculation about German U-boats. The pattern was clear. Any information that suggested the explosion might have involved American officials or pointed to a more complex conspiracy was systematically removed from public discourse. Within a week, the story had solidified into something clean and simple. Germans bad, Americans victims, war justified. But the most disturbing thing I found wasn't what was published. It was what was buried in the government archives. I spent weeks requesting documents under the Freedom of Information Act. Most were denied or heavily redacted, but I managed to get partial access to files from the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI. What I found there made my blood run cold. Internal memos from August 1916 revealed that federal investigators knew within days that the official story didn't add up. Witness statements contradicted each other. Physical evidence suggested multiple coordinated explosions, not a single sabotage incident. And several witnesses had mentioned seeing American officials in the area before the blast. One memo, dated August 15, 1916, was particularly damning. Recommend suppression of witness statements that implicate domestic parties. German attribution serves national security interests. Case should be closed expeditiously to avoid public panic. The memo was signed by someone whose name was redacted, but the title was visible. Special Assistant to the President. President Woodrow Wilson's administration wasn't just covering up American involvement in Black Tom, they were actively suppressing evidence of it, and they were doing it to manipulate public opinion towards supporting the war. By 1917, when America officially entered World War I, the Black Tom explosion had become a rallying cry. German saboteurs had attacked American soil, damaged an American icon, killed American workers. It was Pearl Harbor before Pearl Harbor, 9/11 before 9/11. Except it wasn't. It was something much worse. An attack carried out with American assistance, covered up by American officials, and used to drag America into a war that made specific American companies incredibly wealthy. The cover-up wasn't just about hiding the truth, it was about weaponizing a lie. Standing on Liberty Island, looking up at the Statue of Liberty's torch, you can see the scars if you know where to look. The official tour guides will tell you that the torch has been closed to public access since 1916 due to structural damage from the Black Tom explosion. They make it sound like a minor inconvenience, a bit of historical trivia. The truth is much more disturbing. I managed to get access to the original engineering reports from 1916, filed by the Army Corps of Engineers immediately after the explosion. What they found was structural damage far beyond what has ever been publicly acknowledged. Shrapnel hadn't just embedded in the copper skin of the torch, it had penetrated deep into the internal framework, compromising the statue's structural integrity. But here's what really caught my attention. The pattern of damage wasn't consistent with a random explosion. The shrapnel strikes were concentrated on specific sections of the torch, almost like someone had aimed the blast to hit particular symbolic targets. The report included detailed photographs that I'd never seen before. Close-ups of the damage showed pieces of metal embedded in the statue's torch arm, but also in her crown and tablet. The inscription on the tablet, July 4, Mdkaleksuski, July 4, 1776, had been partially obliterated by shrapnel. Someone had damaged America's symbol of freedom on the anniversary month of American independence. If that was coincidence, it was a hell of a coincidence. I started researching the conspiracy theories that had grown up around the symbolic nature of the attack. Some claimed the timing and target selection were evidence of ritual occultism, that the explosion had been designed as a symbolic assault on American liberty itself. Others suggested the damage to the torch, a symbol of enlightenment, was meant to represent the extinguishing of American neutrality. Most of these theories were clearly nonsense, but they all shared a common thread: the recognition that the Black Tom explosion had been too precise, too symbolically loaded to be random sabotage. The engineering reports supported this interpretation. According to the technical analysis, the explosions had been carefully calculated to maximize symbolic damage while minimizing structural collapse. If the goal had been simply to destroy the ammunition depot, the charges could have been placed more efficiently. If the goal had been to cause maximum casualties, the timing would have been different. But if the goal had been to create a symbolic wound in America's most iconic monument, something that would remain visible for over a century as a reminder of foreign attack, then the placement and timing were perfect. The Statue of Liberty's torch remains closed to the public today, 107 years later. Every day, thousands of tourists look up at that damaged torch and remember that America has been attacked before. They remember that foreign enemies have struck at our symbols of freedom, but they don't know that the attack might have been an inside job. Standing there on Liberty Island, I found myself wondering about the people who planned this operation. They hadn't just wanted to destroy an ammunition depot or kill dock workers. They had wanted to wound America's soul, to create a permanent reminder of vulnerability and victimization. And they had wanted that wound to be visible from Manhattan forever. My grandfather had worked for Consolidated Maritime Insurance Company from 1965 to 1985. It was a small company that handled specialized marine and industrial policies, mostly for New Jersey businesses. When he retired, they gave him a modest pension and a company watch. When the company was bought out by a larger firm in 1995, most of the old records were supposed to be destroyed. but my grandfather had kept copies of some files. Insurance guys are paranoid about documentation. It's an occupational hazard. And apparently, Consolidated Maritime had inherited some very old files when they bought out Northeastern Mutual Insurance back in 1952. The same Northeastern Mutual that had paid out millions in Black Tom claims. I found my grandfather's old company login credentials in a shoebox, written on a piece of paper along with his social security number and pension account information. The login was for a digital archive system that Consolidated Maritime had set up in the 1990s to digitise their older paper files. I figured the system would be long dead, but insurance companies never throw anything away. The login still worked. What I found in those digital files made everything else look like child's play. Northeastern Mutual hadn't just insured the companies that profited from Black Tom, they had coordinated the whole thing. Internal memos from 1916 laid out the operation in chilling detail. Project Torchlight, target Black Tom Terminal, date July 30th, 1916, objectives 1. Eliminate munitions stockpile preventing competitor access to European markets. 2. Generate insurance payouts to capitalise client war production. 3. Create public sentiment favouring military engagement. There it was, in black and white corporate speak. Black Tom hadn't been sabotage at all. It had been a business plan. The memos outlined how Northeastern Mutual had coordinated with Jersey City Police to provide access to German agents who believed they were conducting legitimate sabotage operations. The Germans thought they were striking a blow against Allied supply lines. They had no idea they were being used as cover for an American corporate conspiracy. German assets have been provided with accurate facility maps and timing schedules. Police cooperation secured through standard municipal influence channels. Anticipated civilian casualties, minimal. Anticipated insurance exposure, $15 to $20 million. Anticipated client profits from war production acceleration, $150 to $200 million over 18 months. They had calculated the death toll. They had weighed American lives against corporate profits and decided the profits were worth it. Other files showed the web of connections that made the operation possible. Northeastern Mutual's board included former government officials, active military officers, and executives from major munitions companies. They hadn't just insured these companies, they had been partners with them. The conspiracy went all the way to Washington. One memo referenced presidential awareness and tacit approval for economic acceleration measures. Wilson himself might not have ordered the Black Tom explosion, but he'd known it was coming and allowed it to happen. But the most disturbing file was dated August 3rd, 1916, the day Samuel Weiser died. It was a brief note from the company's security consultant. Witness situation resolved. River disposal successful. Recommend standard accidental death processing. No further action required. They had murdered Samuel Weiser and documented it in their corporate files like it was just another business expense. As I sat there reading these files, I realised I was looking at evidence of a conspiracy that made Watergate look like a parking ticket. American corporate and government officials had orchestrated a terrorist attack on American soil, used German agents as patsies, murdered witnesses, and used the whole thing as justification for entering a profitable war. And then I realised something else. I was accessing these files through an internet connection. Someone would have logs of my access, digital footprints, timestamps, and IP addresses. If they had killed Samuel Weiser for seeing too much in 1916, what would they do to me for seeing everything in 2023? That's when my laptop froze. The message appeared in the centre of my screen, white text on a black background. You've found enough. Stop digging. I tried to close the browser, restart the computer, pull the power cord, nothing worked. The message just sat there, pulsing slightly, like it was breathing. Then my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Unknown caller. I let it go to voicemail, but it started ringing again immediately. Same caller ID, same insistent tone. On the third call, I answered. Mr. Harrison. The voice was calm, professional, completely emotionless. You've been accessing some very old files tonight. They knew my name. They knew what I'd been doing. They were watching me in real time. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, but my voice cracked. Not exactly convincing. The Northeastern Mutual Archives. Consolidated Maritime Insurance Digital Records. Files related to the Black Tom incident of 1916. You accessed them at 11:47 p.m. using credentials belonging to Robert Harrison, deceased. Your grandfather, I believe. I hung up. The phone rang again immediately. That was rude, the voice said when I answered. Let me explain your situation. You have discovered information that certain parties would prefer to remain private. You have accessed this information through unauthorized means, which makes you criminally liable. You have also, unfortunately for you, triggered several security protocols that notify us when these particular files are viewed. Who is us? I asked. That's not important. What's important is that you understand the gravity of your situation. The Black Tom incident was resolved over a century ago. All parties involved are long deceased. The companies, the government officials, the insurance carriers, all gone. There is no one left to prosecute, no one left to blame, no one left to hold accountable. Except the people covering it up, I said. No, the voice said patiently. There is no cover-up. There is simply institutional continuity. The files you've accessed are maintained for historical completeness, not because anyone intends to act on the information they contain. They are quite literally ancient history. Ancient history that you kill people to protect. Samuel Weser died in 1916. Anyone who might have ordered his death would be over 150 years old today. Do you see the problem with your conspiracy theory? But I was starting to understand something else. The companies might be gone, but the money isn't. The profits from World War I, the insurance payouts, the connections, all of that got passed down, didn't it? To new companies, new families, new power structures. There was a pause. You're smarter than I hoped you'd be. So what happens now? You kill me too? Mr. Harrison, we live in a different world than Samuel Weser did. In 1916, a dock worker could simply disappear without anyone asking difficult questions. Today, a young man with a laptop and a social media presence cannot vanish without generating exactly the kind of attention we prefer to avoid. So I'm safe? You're useful. Your grandfather kept copies of files he shouldn't have kept. His login credentials provided access to archives that should have been deleted decades ago. You've helped us identify security vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. For that we're grateful. I could hear typing in the background. However, your usefulness has limits. You will not publish anything about Black Tom Island. You will not share the files you've accessed. You will not discuss this conversation with anyone. You will delete any copies you've made of these documents and return any physical materials you've found to their proper storage. And if I don't, then you'll discover that the methods we used to silence witnesses in 1916 were primitive compared to what we can do today. We don't need to throw you in the Hudson River, Mr. Harrison. We can destroy your credit, your employment, your relationships, your online presence, your entire existence without laying a finger on you. We can make you disappear into poverty and isolation while leaving you perfectly visible and alive. The line went dead. My laptop screen flickered and returned to normal, showing the insurance website I'd been browsing as if nothing had happened. But when I tried to access the Northeastern Mutual files again, I got an error message. Archive not found. They had locked me out. But more than that, they had probably deleted everything. All that evidence, all that proof, gone with a few keystrokes. I sat there in my apartment staring at my laptop screen, trying to process what had just happened. A century-old conspiracy, a corporate terrorist attack, government complicity, murder, cover-ups, and it was all just going to disappear back into the shadows where it had been hiding for over 100 years. But they had made one mistake. They had assumed that grandfather only kept digital copies of the files. I still had the trunk. I still had Samuel Weser's letter. I still had the insurance ledger with all those numbers and names and connections. The question was, what was I going to do with them? It's been 3 weeks since that phone call. 3 weeks of looking over my shoulder, checking my credit report, watching for signs that they're following through on their threats. So far, nothing. Maybe they think they've scared me enough. Maybe they're waiting to see if I keep my mouth shut. Maybe they're planning something I won't see coming. I keep thinking about Samuel Weser, about what it must have been like for him in those final days. He had seen something he wasn't supposed to see, and he knew they were coming for him. But he wrote that letter anyway. He documented the truth and hid it away, hoping someone would eventually find it and ask the right questions. Someone like me. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. Samuel Weser wasn't the only witness who disappeared. After that phone call, I couldn't stop digging. Call it obsession, call it stupidity, but I needed to know how deep this thing went. I started researching other people who had been in the area that night, other potential witnesses who might have seen what Weser saw. What I found was a pattern of deaths that stretched far beyond one dock worker. Margaret Flynn, a nurse at the Jersey City Hospital who treated blast victims, died in a gas leak accident in her apartment on August 15th, 1916. She had given interviews to reporters about treating patients with unusual burns that looked more like chemical exposure than explosion injuries. Thomas McKenna, a railroad engineer who claimed to have seen official vehicles leaving Black Tom Island just before the explosion, died when his locomotive mysteriously derailed on August 22nd. The accident report blamed track malformation, but the tracks had been inspected and cleared just hours earlier. Father Giuseppe Torretti, an Italian priest who ran a mission near the waterfront, had been offering shelter to dock workers who were too afraid to return home after the explosion. He wrote in his parish newsletter that several workers had come to him with stories of American officials collaborating with foreign agents. Father Torretti died in his sleep on September the 3rd, officially from a heart attack, though he was only 38 years old and had no history of heart problems. Between August and December 1916, 17 people with direct or indirect connections to the Black Tom explosion died in what the authorities classified as accidents, suicides, or natural causes. 17 people who had either seen something suspicious or had contact with people who claimed to have seen something suspicious. The statistical probability of that many connected deaths occurring by chance is essentially zero. But the most chilling discovery came when I researched the police officers who would have been on duty that night. The Jersey City Police Department roster from July 30th, 1916, listed 12 officers assigned to the Black Tom area. By January 1917, only 4 were still alive. 3 had died in accidents. 2 had committed suicide. 3 had simply disappeared. Their personnel files noted they had abandoned their posts, and warrants were issued for desertion, but they were never found. The 4 survivors all received promotions and commendations for their heroic service during the Black Tom crisis. They went on to have distinguished careers, rising to positions of authority within the department. One became police chief in 1925. The pattern was unmistakable. Anyone who might have contradicted the official story was eliminated. Anyone who supported it was rewarded. The Black Tom explosion wasn't just sabotage. It was a blueprint for how corporate interests, government corruption, and foreign threats could be combined to manipulate American public opinion and justify profitable wars. It was a beta test for the military-industrial complex that would define American foreign policy for the next century. But more than that, it was a demonstration of how completely a democratic society could be controlled if you had enough money, enough influence, and enough willingness to kill your own citizens. Insurance fraud, corporate greed, and hidden hands pushing America into war. These weren't aberrations. They were features. They were how the system was designed to work. And if they silenced 17 witnesses in 1916 to protect that system, what do you think they'll do to me? I've uploaded copies of everything to multiple cloud servers under fake accounts. I've mailed physical copies to journalists, historians, and conspiracy researchers around the country. I've created dead man switches that will automatically publish everything if I don't check in regularly. But I know it probably won't matter. They've had over a century to perfect their methods. They've had over a century to build networks of influence and control that make the 1916 conspiracy look like amateur hour. If they want this story buried, they'll find a way to bury it. And they've already started trying. 2 days after that phone call, I got a letter from the IRS audit notice. Random selection, they claimed. But the timing was suspiciously convenient. Then my credit card company called about unusual activity and froze my accounts pending a fraud investigation. My employer received an anonymous tip that I had been accessing company computers for personal research projects, which led to a formal disciplinary review. Each incident by itself could be coincidence. Together they formed a pattern of pressure designed to make me too busy dealing with bureaucratic nightmares to continue investigating Black Tom. But the real message came when I tried to access my grandfather's house. I drove to Jersey City last weekend, planning to go through the attic more thoroughly. Maybe there were other documents I had missed, other evidence that could corroborate Samuel Weiser's story. But when I got to the house, there was a condemned notice on the front door. According to the city building inspector who posted the notice, the house had structural integrity issues that made it unsafe for occupancy. The foundation was allegedly compromised, the roof was supposedly on the verge of collapse, and the electrical system posed an imminent fire hazard. Funny thing is, I'd been in that house just 3 weeks earlier, and it was perfectly fine, sturdy as the day it was built. But now, according to official city records, it was a death trap that needed to be demolished immediately. The demolition was scheduled for the following Monday, 72 hours from the time I received the notice. I called the building inspector's office trying to get more information about the inspection process, the specific problems they had identified, anything that might explain the sudden urgency. But the inspector who had signed the notice was unavailable, and his supervisor was in meetings all day. What I did learn, through some creative phone calls to neighbours, was that men in suits had been going door to door in the neighbourhood, asking about the old Harrison place, and whether anyone had seen suspicious activity around the property recently. They claimed to be federal investigators looking into potential environmental hazards, but they wouldn't show identification, and they left no business cards. The neighbours were scared. One elderly woman told me that the men had made it clear that asking too many questions about their investigation would not be in her best interests. I realised then that they weren't just trying to silence me. They were trying to eliminate all physical evidence of what I had discovered. The trunk, the documents, anything that might corroborate my story was about to be buried under a pile of rubble. So I did something stupid. I broke into my own grandfather's house. The structural integrity issues were bullshit, of course. The house was solid as a rock. But what I found in the attic made my blood run cold. The trunk was gone. Not just moved or damaged, completely gone, along with everything it had contained. Samuel Weiser's letter, the insurance ledger, the burned papers, all of it. In place of the trunk, there was a neat pile of ash on the attic floor, as if someone had burned everything and carefully swept up the remains. But they had missed something. Hidden behind a loose floorboard, I found another document, one I hadn't discovered during my first visit. It was a carbon copy of Samuel Weiser's letter, written in the same handwriting but addressed to someone different. Father Toretti, it began. If something happens to me, please make sure this information reaches the right people. This was Weiser's insurance policy. He had made copies of his account and hidden them with different people, hoping that even if they found and destroyed one version, another might survive. The letter to Father Toretti was identical to the one I had found in the trunk, but it included an additional paragraph at the end. They know I saw them. 2 of the police officers came by my boarding house yesterday, asking questions about my work schedule, my family, whether I'd been talking to reporters. They were friendly enough, but there was something in their eyes that made my skin crawl. I've decided to leave Jersey City for a while, maybe visit my cousin in Philadelphia until this all blows over. If you're reading this, it means I never made it to the train station. Samuel Weiser had known they were coming for him. He had tried to run, and they had caught him anyway. But more importantly, he had trusted Father Toretti with a copy of his story. The same Father Toretti who had died of a heart attack just a few weeks later. Still, I had to try. Samuel Weiser died trying to tell this story. Father Toretti died trying to protect it. The least I can do is risk my comfortable middle-class existence to tell it properly. Because the thing is, Black Tom wasn't a one-time event. It was a proof of concept. If you know what to look for, you can see the same patterns repeating throughout American history. Convenient attacks that justify profitable wars, corporate interests aligned with government policy, witnesses who disappear or discredit themselves. The methods get more sophisticated, but the fundamental approach remains the same. Create a crisis, control the narrative, profit from the solution. How many other foreign attacks on American soil have actually been domestic operations? How many other Samuel Weisers have been silenced before they could tell their stories? How many other trunks full of evidence are sitting in American attics, waiting for curious grandchildren to find them? I don't know if anyone will believe this story. I don't know if anyone will care enough to dig deeper. I don't know if I'll be around to find out. But I know this. The people who orchestrated the Black Tom explosion, who murdered Samuel Weser, who have spent over a century protecting this secret, they're still out there. Maybe not the same individuals, but the same institutions, the same networks, the same fundamental corruption. And they're still... The recording cuts off abruptly. The file is timestamped 3:17 a.m, November 15th, 2023. No further recordings have been found. What if I told you that buried beneath the frozen wastelands of Alaska lies something that could change everything we know about human history? Something that's not ancient at all, but very much alive. Tonight's story comes from a request by Matul Patel 9283. Thank you for this incredible suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. And if you enjoy these tales that blur the line between fact and fiction, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more mysterious stories that will keep you wondering. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is what I found beneath 200 feet of Alaskan permafrost, and why the government wants me to forget it ever existed. I'm a civil engineer, nothing glamorous about it. I measure soil density, calculate load-bearing capacities, and make sure buildings don't sink into the ground. For 15 years, I've worked contracts across the country, from Florida swamplands to Nevada deserts. Alaska was supposed to be just another job. The US Army Corps of Engineers hired me in March 2023 to survey land stability for a proposed pipeline route. Nothing unusual there. Energy companies are always looking to move oil from point A to point B, and they need someone to tell them their pipes won't crack when the ground shifts. The pay was good, the timeline was reasonable, and I needed the work. The assignment took me to a stretch of wilderness about 60 miles northwest of Fairbanks. On paper, it looked simple, a 3-month survey of geological stability across a 40-mile corridor. I'd use ground-penetrating radar, seismographs and core samples to map what lay beneath the surface. Standard procedure. I should have known something was off when they gave me a satellite phone with specific instructions to check in every 12 hours. Weather can change fast up there, the project coordinator explained. We need to know you're alive. But Alaska's a dangerous place. People disappear into the wilderness all the time. It seemed reasonable. I flew into Fairbanks on a Tuesday in April, rented a heavy-duty pickup truck and loaded it with equipment. The drive to my assigned sector took 3 hours on increasingly rough roads. The last 20 miles were barely more than frozen tyre tracks cutting through endless stands of black spruce and birch. When I finally reached my starting coordinates, the silence was absolute. No wind, no animals, no aircraft overhead. Just me, my equipment, and thousands of square miles of nothing. That's when the work began, and that's when everything I thought I knew about the world started to unravel. The first week went exactly as planned. I established a base camp with a generator-powered trailer and methodically began surveying the proposed pipeline route. The ground-penetrating radar showed typical permafrost patterns, layers of ice and soil that had been frozen for millennia. My seismograph readings were clean, showing the kind of stable bedrock that pipeline engineers love to see. Core samples revealed nothing unusual, standard Arctic soil composition with good load-bearing characteristics. I was making excellent progress. Then, on day 8, something changed. I was setting up the radar array for the morning survey when I noticed interference patterns on my display. Instead of the usual chaotic scattering that indicates rock and soil, I was seeing geometric shapes. At first I assumed it was equipment malfunction. Electronic devices can act strangely in extreme cold, and I'd been pushing my gear hard. I recalibrated the radar, replaced cables, and ran diagnostic tests. Everything checked out perfectly, but the shapes remained straight lines, perfect 90-degree angles, and beneath everything a massive triangular form with sides that extended beyond my radar's maximum penetration depth of 200 feet. I switched to the seismograph, thinking maybe sound waves would give me different data. I set off small explosive charges and measured how the shock waves travelled through the ground. Standard geological surveying technique. The results made no sense. Sound waves were reflecting off something solid and geometrically perfect about 150 feet down. The reflection pattern showed clean edges, flat surfaces, and precise angles. In nature, you don't find precise angles. Rivers meander, mountains erode into curves, and rock formations crack in random patterns. This was something else entirely. I spent the rest of that day running every test I could think of. Different frequencies, multiple angles, overlapping surveys. Every single measurement confirmed the same impossible truth. There was a massive pyramid buried beneath the permafrost, and it was huge. My calculations suggested sides at least 800 feet long, significantly larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. The depth readings indicated it was sitting on bedrock, which meant it had been built on the surface and then buried by millions of years of geological processes. Except that made no sense either. Alaska's geological history doesn't include ancient civilizations capable of megalithic construction. The entire region was under glacial ice, until relatively recently in geological terms. I sat in my trailer that night staring at the printouts and digital displays, trying to find any explanation that didn't challenge everything I understood about engineering and archaeology. Maybe it was a natural formation that just happened to look geometric. Maybe my instruments were picking up interference from buried metal or deposits. Maybe the extreme cold was affecting my equipment in ways I didn't understand. But deep down I knew I was looking at something artificial, something that had been deliberately constructed and then hidden beneath the ice. The question was, who built it, and why? I needed supplies, and more importantly, I needed to talk to someone who knew the area's history. The nearest settlement was a village called Yukon Crossing. Population 127 according to the road sign. It was a 40-minute drive south on a road that tested every shock absorber in my truck. Yukon Crossing looked like a lot of rural Alaskan towns. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around a general store and a combination post office / gas station. Most of the residents lived in trailer homes or log cabins scattered among the trees. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin grey columns against the bright spring sky. The general store served as the unofficial community centre. Inside, I found an elderly native Alaskan man named Joseph Kaltag behind the counter, selling everything from canned goods to ammunition to fishing gear. He looked like he'd been running the place for decades. "You're the pipeline engineer," he said before I could introduce myself. It wasn't a question. "Word travels fast," I replied. "Not much happens around here." He rang up my purchases: batteries, fuel canisters, and enough food to last another week. "You working up in the Forbidden Valley?" I looked up from counting cash. Forbidden Valley? Joseph's weathered face remained expressionless, but I caught something in his eyes. Concern, maybe, or warning. That's what my grandfather called it. Said the spirits there were angry, animals won't go near it, and hunters who get too close. He shrugged. "Their compasses don't work right." "Magnetic interference," I said automatically. "Probably iron ore deposits in the bedrock. Maybe," he handed me my change, "or maybe some things are better left buried." I was loading supplies into my truck when a younger native woman approached. She introduced herself as Marie Kaltag, Joseph's granddaughter, and a pilot who flew supply runs to remote camps throughout the region. "I heard you talking to Grandpa," she said, "about the valley where you're working." He mentioned compass problems. Marie glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "It's more than that. I've flown over that area maybe 50 times in the last 10 years. My instruments go crazy. GPS cuts out, radio gets static, engine RPMs fluctuate." "Electromagnetic interference," I suggested. That's what I thought too. But 3 years ago I was flying a supply run to a hunting camp about 20 miles north of your work site. Clear day, perfect visibility. I was following the river when my GPS started spinning. Compass needle was rotating like a clock hand. She paused, clearly uncomfortable with the memory. I looked down to try to navigate by landmarks, and I saw something that shouldn't have been there. Lines in the snow, geometric patterns like someone had carved designs into the landscape. They were huge, maybe a mile across and perfectly symmetrical. Could have been natural formations, wind patterns, erosion channels. Marie shook her head. "I've been flying over Alaska my whole life. I know what natural looks like. This was artificial. And when I flew back over the same area a week later, the lines were gone, covered by fresh snow." I thanked her for the information and headed back to camp, but I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Geometric patterns in the snow, electromagnetic interference, compasses spinning wildly. It all pointed to the same conclusion I was trying to avoid. Something beneath the permafrost was actively affecting the environment around it. That night, I reviewed my survey data again, looking for any detail I might have missed. The pyramid structure was consistent across all my measurements, but there was something else. Subtle variations in the electromagnetic readings that suggested complex internal architecture. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just a solid mass of stone. It had chambers, passages, and what looked like intricate internal mechanisms. And according to my instruments, some of those mechanisms were drawing electrical current. I woke up on day 12 to the sound of helicopter rotors. From my trailer window I could see a Black Hawk settling onto a flat area about 200 yards from my camp. No military markings, but the aircraft had the unmistakable look of government hardware. 3 men in winter camouflage climbed out as the rotors spun down. They walked directly to my trailer with the confident stride of people who expected cooperation. The leader was a tall man with close-cropped hair and reflective sunglasses. His companions looked like soldiers trying to dress like civilians, too alert, too fit, and carrying themselves like they had weapons hidden under their jackets. "Mr. Harrison," the leader said, reading my name from a tablet. "I'm Agent Collins, Department of Homeland Security. We need to discuss your recent survey findings." I stepped outside, keeping my expression neutral. I wasn't aware DHS had jurisdiction over pipeline surveys. "We have jurisdiction over potential national security threats." Collins gestured toward my equipment array. "Your seismic activity has been flagged by our monitoring systems. We need to examine your data and confiscate any materials related to subsurface anomalies." "What subsurface anomalies?" Collins removed his sunglasses, revealing pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Mr. Harrison, we know exactly what you found down there. The question is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or make this difficult." I had 2 choices: hand over my data willingly or watch them take it by force. Either way, they were getting what they wanted. "The hard drives are in the trailer," I said. One of Collins' men immediately headed inside while the other began disconnecting my external monitoring equipment. They worked with practiced efficiency, clearly familiar with this type of confiscation. "How long have you known it was there?" I asked. Collins was quiet for a long moment, apparently deciding how much to tell me. "The structure first appeared on our deep scanning systems in 1992. We've been monitoring it ever since." "Appeared? You mean you discovered it in 1992? "No, Mr. Harrison. I mean it appeared in 1992. Prior to that date, our scans showed normal bedrock composition. Then something changed." The man emerging from my trailer handed Collins a bag containing my hard drives and backup storage devices. They had also taken my printed survey maps and handwritten notes. 1992, I said, thinking out loud. That's when China conducted their largest underground nuclear test. Collins' expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe, that I'd made that connection. The Lopner test was 3,800 miles away, he said. There's no possible connection. But his tone suggested otherwise. And I remembered something from my geological studies. Seismic waves from large underground explosions can travel through the Earth's crust and trigger responses in sensitive areas thousands of miles away. What if the Chinese nuclear test had somehow activated whatever was buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost? You're being reassigned, Collins continued, handing me an official-looking document. Your contract has been terminated due to unforeseeable circumstances. A helicopter will arrive tomorrow morning to transport you back to Fairbanks. What about my equipment? It's been contaminated by proximity to hazardous materials. Standard decontamination procedures require disposal. That was obviously a lie. There were no hazardous materials in the area. I'd have detected them during my survey. They were confiscating everything because they didn't want me to have any physical evidence of what I'd found. One more thing, Collins said as his team prepared to leave. You'll be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement before returning to civilian areas. The penalty for violating that agreement is 10 years in federal prison. They climbed back into their helicopter and lifted off, leaving me alone with my suddenly empty trailer and a growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something much bigger than a pipeline survey. But I still had one advantage. They thought they'd taken all my data. They were wrong. I've always been paranoid about data backup. Too many years of watching hard drives crash and taking blame for lost survey information. So I keep a small handheld GPS unit with built-in memory storage that automatically logs all my location coordinates and instrument readings. Collins and his team had missed it because it was clipped to my belt, looked like standard hiking gear, and wasn't connected to my main computer systems. That night, I reviewed the stored data on the device's tiny screen. Everything was there. Coordinates, depth readings, electromagnetic measurements, and seismic mapping data. Enough information to prove that something massive and artificial was buried beneath the permafrost. But proof wasn't enough. I needed to understand what it was and why the government was so determined to keep it secret. I made a decision that probably should have gotten me killed. I was going back to the site for one final investigation. The helicopter pickup was scheduled for 8 a.m, which gave me about 6 hours of darkness to work with. I loaded basic equipment into my backpack. The handheld GPS, the digital camera, a small electromagnetic field detector, and a battery-powered radio, and hiked back to the survey area. The night was clear and bitterly cold. My breath formed ice crystals that seemed to hang in the air, and the snow crunched under my boots with sounds like breaking glass. Above me, the aurora borealis painted green curtains across the star-filled sky. I reached the coordinates where my instruments had detected the pyramid's apex. According to my calculations, I was standing directly above the structure's highest point, about 120 feet below my boots. The handheld detector immediately started showing readings. Electromagnetic activity was significantly higher than background levels, and it seemed to be increasing. The device's small screen showed wave patterns that looked almost like a heartbeat, regular pulses of energy rising and falling in consistent cycles. I took photos of the instrument readings and recorded GPS coordinates, building a digital record that I could hopefully smuggle out of Alaska. But as I worked, something strange began happening. The aurora overhead was changing. Instead of the usual flowing curtains of light, it was forming geometric patterns, straight lines and angular shapes that mirrored the underground structure. It was as if the buried pyramid was somehow influencing the electromagnetic phenomena in the upper atmosphere. That's when I felt the vibration. It started as a barely perceptible tremor in the ground, like the feeling of a distant freight train. But it quickly intensified until I could feel it in my bones, a deep, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to synchronize with the electromagnetic readings on my detector. The device's screen was flashing warnings. Energy levels were spiking far beyond anything I'd measured during my official survey. Whatever was buried down there was waking up. I started backing away from the site, but before I could get more than 50 yards, everything electronic I carried died simultaneously. The GPS unit, the detector, my digital camera, even my LED flashlight, all dead, as if something had delivered a massive electromagnetic pulse. Above me, the aurora was blazing brighter than I'd ever seen, forming complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The air itself seemed to be humming with energy, and I could feel static electricity building up on my clothing and exposed skin. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The aurora faded back to normal patterns. The ground vibration ceased. The electrical sensation disappeared. I was left standing in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness in complete darkness, holding a handful of dead electronics. I stumbled back toward camp using starlight for navigation, reaching my trailer just before dawn. When I tried to start my truck, the engine turned over immediately. Apparently whatever had killed my handheld electronics hadn't affected the vehicle's more robust electrical system. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't natural. The buried pyramid wasn't just an ancient artifact or geological formation. It was some kind of active installation that could influence electromagnetic fields across a wide area. The question was, what was its purpose? The helicopter arrived exactly at 8 a.m, piloted by a civilian contractor who seemed unaware that he was participating in a government cover-up. During the flight back to Fairbanks, I signed the non-disclosure agreement Collins had mentioned, legally binding myself to remain silent about my discoveries. But signing the paper didn't erase my memory, and it didn't eliminate the data I'd managed to keep hidden. I flew back to Seattle that afternoon and spent the next 2 weeks trying to return to normal life. I updated my resume, contacted potential clients, and attempted to focus on finding my next engineering contract. But I couldn't stop thinking about what lay buried beneath the Alaskan permafrost. Late one night, unable to sleep, I sat down with my laptop and started researching everything I could find about electromagnetic anomalies, underground structures, and the 1992 Chinese nuclear test that Agent Collins had mentioned. What I discovered changed everything. The Chinese test, conducted at the Lop Nür facility on May 21, 1992, was indeed one of the largest underground nuclear explosions ever detonated. The blast was so powerful that seismic monitoring stations around the world recorded the shockwaves as they travelled through the Earth's crust. But that wasn't the interesting part. I found archived scientific papers describing unusual electromagnetic phenomena that occurred globally in the days following the test. Radio disruptions, satellite communication failures, and compass anomalies were reported from locations thousands of miles away from the blast site. Most significantly, several research stations in Alaska reported sudden spikes in local electromagnetic activity, beginning approximately 6 hours after the Chinese detonation. Exactly the amount of time it would take seismic waves to travel through the Earth's crust from Lop Nür to Alaska. I cross-referenced these reports with geological surveys of the Alaskan region and found something that made my blood run cold. Every single electromagnetic anomaly had been reported from locations within a 50-mile radius of my survey site. Whatever was buried there had indeed been activated by the Chinese nuclear test, just as Collins had implied, but the implications went far beyond a simple cause and effect relationship. I started plotting the locations of other reported anomalies on a world map, looking for patterns. What I found was a global network of similar sites, places where electromagnetic activity had spiked following major seismic events, underground installations that seemed to respond to specific triggers. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that the Alaskan pyramid wasn't unique. It was part of a worldwide system of buried structures, all apparently designed to respond to geological disturbances, but designed by whom, and for what purpose? I thought back to the night I'd witnessed the energy pulse, remembering how the aurora borealis had formed geometric patterns directly above the burial site. Aurora phenomena are caused by charged particles from the sun interacting with Earth's magnetic field. If the underground structure could influence those interactions, it was essentially broadcasting energy into space. What if the buried pyramids weren't ancient monuments at all? What if they were communication devices, a global network designed to transmit signals to somewhere far beyond Earth? The possibility was terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. If I was right, then humanity shared the planet with technology that predated our entire civilization by potentially millions of years. Technology that was still active, still responding to triggers, still sending messages to unknown recipients. I spent weeks researching similar sites around the world, building a database of locations where unusual electromagnetic phenomena had been reported following major seismic events. The pattern that emerged was undeniable, a global network of transmission stations, all apparently activated by disturbances in the Earth's crust. But before I could take my research any further, I received a letter that ended my investigation permanently. The letter arrived exactly 1 month after my return from Alaska. It was delivered by certified mail to my apartment address, though I hadn't given that information to anyone connected with the pipeline project. The return address showed only Department of Interior Special Projects Division, with a Washington, D.C. postal box number. Inside was a single page of official letterhead containing a brief message. Mr. Harrison, this communication serves as final notice regarding your terminated contract with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, project classification, Black Ice. Subsequent to your departure from the survey area, additional geological analysis has determined that the subsurface structure you detected is not archaeological in nature. The structure is an active installation of unknown origin that poses potential risks to national security. Any attempt to publicise information related to this discovery will result in immediate prosecution under the Espionage Act of 1917. Your signed non-disclosure agreement remains in full effect indefinitely. The installation you discovered is not a relic. It is a machine. Do not pursue further inquiry. Sincerely, Director, Special Projects Division. I read the letter 3 times before the full implication sank in. They weren't denying what I'd found. They were confirming it. The underground structure was artificial. It was active. And the government had known about it for over 30 years without understanding what it was or who had built it. But the most chilling aspect was the letter's final warning. It is a machine, not a monument, not an archaeological site, not a natural formation, a machine. I thought about the energy pulse I'd witnessed, the geometric patterns in the aurora, the electromagnetic signals that seemed to respond to seismic events around the world. If the buried pyramid was indeed a machine, then its purpose was clear. It was designed to detect and respond to geological disturbances by transmitting signals into space. The question remained, signals to whom? I locked the letter in a safety deposit box along with copies of all my survey data and research findings. If something happened to me, at least there would be evidence that the discovery had been made. But I never published my findings. I never contacted journalists or researchers or anyone else who might be interested in the truth about what lay beneath the Alaskan permafrost, because I realised that some knowledge carries a price too high to pay. If there really was a global network of alien communication devices buried beneath our feet, broadcasting our planet's geological status to unknown recipients in space, then humanity was living on borrowed time. We were tenants on a world that belonged to someone else, someone who had installed monitoring equipment long before our species existed. The machines weren't dormant relics of an ancient civilization. They were active components of a surveillance system that was still operational after millions of years. And every earthquake, every volcanic eruption, every nuclear test was sending updates to whoever had built them. I returned to my normal life as a civil engineer, taking contracts that kept me far from Alaska and far from any situation that might uncover similar installations. I told myself that ignorance was safer than knowledge, that some secrets were better left buried. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening, and I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. For 6 months, I managed to convince myself that forgetting was possible. I took contracts in familiar territories, building inspections in suburban developments, soil analysis for shopping mall construction, routine work that involved nothing more mysterious than concrete and rebar. Then the dream started. At first they were just fragments, flashes of geometric light, the sound of deep humming that seemed to vibrate through my bones, the sensation of standing on solid ground while everything around me pulsed with invisible energy. I'd wake up with my heart racing and a metallic taste in my mouth as if I'd been breathing electrified air. But the dreams became more vivid as weeks passed. I began seeing the pyramid not from above, as I had during my survey, but from within. Vast chambers carved from black stone that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Corridors that stretched beyond the reach of any illumination, filled with the constant sound of machinery that had been running for millennia. In these dreams, I wasn't alone. Shadowy figures moved through the passages, tall, elongated forms that seemed more like geometric projections than living beings. They moved with purpose, tending to controls and displays that covered the walls in intricate patterns of light and symbol. The most disturbing part was that they seemed aware of me. In the dreams, they would pause their activities and turn toward me with attention that felt like cold judgment. Without faces I could recognize, without voices I could understand, they somehow communicated a single clear message. I had seen something I wasn't meant to see. I consulted a sleep specialist, thinking the dreams were delayed stress responses from my time in Alaska. She prescribed medication that helped me fall asleep but didn't stop the visions. If anything, the drugs made them more intense, more real, more impossible to dismiss as products of an overwrought imagination. It was during one of these medicated dreams that I saw something new, a global map covered in points of light, each one marking a location where similar pyramids lay buried. The network stretched across every continent, even beneath the ocean floors, hundreds of installation sites, all connected by lines of energy that pulsed in synchronized patterns. I woke from that dream with absolute certainty that I was seeing something real. The buried machines weren't isolated installations. They were nodes in a planetary communication grid that spanned the entire world. 3 days later, I made a decision that changed everything. I started investigating again. Using the global locations from my dreams as starting points, I began researching electromagnetic anomalies and unexplained phenomena at similar sites around the world. What I found was a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidental. Every location where I dreamed of seeing a pyramid corresponded to a place where unusual events had been reported. The Nazca lines in Peru, built over an area where aircraft instruments malfunctioned regularly. The underwater structures near Bimini in the Bahamas, where submarines had reported mechanical failures and compass deviations. The Giza Plateau in Egypt, where modern surveys had detected massive voids beneath the known pyramids. Each site shared common characteristics: electromagnetic interference, geometric precision in ancient or unexplained structures, and a history of covering up or dismissing scientific findings that couldn't be easily explained. But the most significant pattern was temporal. Every site had experienced increased activity following major seismic events, exactly like the Alaskan installation after the 1992 Chinese nuclear test. I compiled a database of seismic events and electromagnetic anomalies dating back 50 years. The correlation was undeniable. Large earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and underground nuclear tests consistently triggered responses from specific locations around the globe. The buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity, they were responding to it, broadcasting information about Earth's internal dynamics to receivers beyond our planet. I was building a case for the existence of a global alien surveillance network when I made a discovery that terrified me more than anything I'd found so far. The activity was increasing. According to my research, electromagnetic anomalies at these sites had been relatively stable for decades, showing only minor fluctuations in response to major geological events. But starting in 2020, the baseline activity levels had begun rising at all locations simultaneously. Something was changing. The network was becoming more active, more responsive, more awake. I plotted the activity increases on a timeline and noticed they correlated with something unexpected. The global increase in seismic activity over the past few years. More earthquakes, more volcanic eruptions, more geological instability than had been recorded in previous decades. What if the relationship wasn't cause and effect? What if the buried machines weren't just monitoring geological activity? What if they were causing it? The possibility was so disturbing I initially dismissed it as paranoid speculation. But the more I studied the data, the more compelling the evidence became. The timing was too precise. The correlations too consistent. If I was right, then humanity was living on a planet where alien technology was actively destabilizing the geological systems that supported all life on Earth. But why? What possible purpose could be served by triggering earthquakes and volcanic eruptions? The answer came to me during another dream, but this time I was prepared. I had set up a digital recorder beside my bed, hoping to capture any words or sounds I might make while experiencing the visions. What I heard when I played back the recording the next morning was my own voice, but speaking words I didn't remember saying: stress testing, planetary stability assessment, structural analysis phase approaching completion. I'd somehow been speaking in the technical language of engineering, describing the geological chaos as if it were a planned evaluation of the planet's physical integrity. The machines weren't trying to destroy Earth, they were testing it. Over the following weeks, I dove deeper into geological data, looking for patterns that might support my terrifying hypothesis. What I found convinced me that the buried network was conducting a systematic analysis of Earth's structural stability. Seismic events weren't random, they were following a pattern. Stress points in tectonic plates were being tested in sequence, as if something was methodically evaluating how much pressure the planet's crust could withstand before catastrophic failure. The 2011 Japanese earthquake and tsunami, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, the increasing volcanic activity in Indonesia, Italy and Iceland, the unprecedented earthquake swarms in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas. All of these events clustered around locations where I'd identified buried installations. I created detailed models showing how the network might be triggering these events through focused electromagnetic pulses directed at specific geological fault lines. The technology required would be far beyond human capabilities, but for a civilization that could build planet-spanning monitoring networks, it would be routine engineering. But the most chilling aspect of my research was the timeline. If the current rate of geological testing continued, the network would have evaluated every major tectonic system on Earth within the next 5 to 10 years. What would happen when the testing phase was complete? I spent sleepless nights imagining scenarios, planetary mining operations that required clearing the surface of inconvenient biological life, terraforming projects that would remake Earth's atmosphere and geology, or simple property reclamation by the network's builders returning to a world they had left unattended for millennia. None of the possibilities included a future for human civilization. It was during this period of growing despair that I received an unexpected contact that changed everything once again. The email appeared in my inbox on a Tuesday morning with a subject line that made my blood freeze. Alaskan survey data, classification black ice. The sender's address was scrambled text that looked like a random string of characters, clearly routed through multiple encryption services to hide its origin. But the message content was brief and specific. Mr. Harrison, we know what you've discovered about the global network. Your research parallels investigations conducted by others who have encountered similar installations. A meeting has been arranged. Be at the Starbucks on Pine Street in downtown Seattle tomorrow at 3 p.m. Come alone. Bring your data. You're not the only one who has seen the machines. The message included no signature, but attached to it was a single photograph that made my hands shake, an image of my own survey equipment at the Alaskan site, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been watching my investigation from a significant distance. Someone had been monitoring me during my time in Alaska, someone who wasn't part of Agent Collins' government team. I spent the entire night debating whether to attend the meeting. It could be a trap. Government agents trying to identify how much I knew and what evidence I still possessed. Or it could be exactly what it claimed: contact with others who had discovered the truth about the buried network. In the end, curiosity won over caution. I needed to know if I was really alone in this knowledge, or if there were others working to understand the threat humanity was facing. The Starbucks was crowded with the usual mix of students, business people and remote workers when I arrived at exactly 3 p.m. I ordered coffee and found a table near the back, trying to identify anyone who might be waiting for me. At 3:15, a woman in her 50s approached my table. She had greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wore field clothing that suggested outdoor work, and carried herself with the confident posture of someone accustomed to physical challenges. Mr. Harrison, she extended her hand. I'm Catherine Webb. I think we need to talk. She sat down across from me and immediately began speaking in low, urgent tones. I'm a marine archaeologist. 3 years ago, I was leading a deep-sea survey off the coast of Bermuda, when my team discovered an underwater structure that shouldn't exist. Geometric, massive, and actively generating electromagnetic fields that interfered with our equipment. She opened a tablet and showed me sonar images that looked remarkably similar to my ground-penetrating radar data from Alaska. A pyramid-shaped structure, perfectly symmetrical, sitting on the ocean floor at a depth of nearly a mile. When we tried to publish our findings, the research was classified and our funding was terminated. Sound familiar? I nodded, unable to speak. Catherine continued, but I kept investigating privately. I found evidence of at least 12 similar installations in deep ocean locations around the world. All of them show the same characteristics: geometric precision, electromagnetic activity, and apparent activation following seismic events. She showed me more images: underwater structures near Japan, the Mediterranean, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Each one was clearly artificial, clearly ancient, and clearly active. There are others, she said. A geologist in Australia who found similar structures in the outback. An archaeologist in Egypt who discovered chambers beneath the Sphinx that contain technology that shouldn't exist. A seismologist in Chile who documented electromagnetic pulses preceding earthquake activity. How many others? We've identified 17 researchers worldwide who have encountered installations or phenomena that appear to be part of the same network. Most have been silenced through official pressure, funding cuts, or career destruction. A few have simply disappeared. Catherine leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But some of us have continued working in secret. We've been sharing data, building a comprehensive picture of what we're dealing with. And what are we dealing with? A global surveillance and control system that's been operating for thousands of years, possibly millions. The installations aren't just monitoring Earth, they're managing it, controlling geological processes, atmospheric composition, even biological evolution through environmental manipulation. The implications hit me like a physical blow. We're not alone on this planet. We never have been. The question is whether humanity developed naturally, or whether we're the result of controlled biological development guided by whoever built the network. Catherine showed me more data. Archaeological evidence of genetic bottlenecks in human evolution that corresponded to periods of unusual geological activity, atmospheric changes that seemed to follow patterns rather than random climate variation, even extinction events that appeared to have been artificially triggered. The network has been shaping Earth's development for millions of years, she said. Every mass extinction, every ice age, every major evolutionary leap has been guided by the installations. But why? What's the purpose? Catherine's expression was grim. We think Earth is being prepared for something. The stress testing you've documented, the increasing seismic activity, the atmospheric changes, it all points to final preparations for some kind of major transition. Transition to what? We don't know, but based on the escalating activity levels, we estimate it will begin within the next few years. She handed me a secure phone with an encrypted communication app. If you want to help us understand what we're facing, this will put you in contact with the others. We're working to decode transmissions from the installations to map the complete network, and to find some way to predict what's coming. What if we can't stop it? Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then at least humanity will know the truth before the end. Over the following months, I became part of an underground network of researchers from around the world. Using encrypted communications and careful operational security, we shared data, theories, and discoveries about the installations that had consumed our professional lives. What emerged from our collective research was a picture of Earth that challenged everything humanity believed about our planet and our place in the universe. The installation network was vast. Over 300 confirmed sites across all continents and ocean floors. Each site contained structures of identical design but varying scale, all built from materials that didn't match any known geological formations. The construction showed evidence of technology far beyond human capabilities. with precision that exceeded our best modern engineering. But the most significant discovery came from Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a linguist and cryptographer in Japan who'd been analysing electromagnetic transmissions intercepted from the installations. The transmissions weren't random energy pulses, they were coded communications in a mathematical language that described Earth's physical and biological status in incredible detail. Real-time reports on atmospheric composition, geological stability, ocean chemistry, magnetic field fluctuations and biological diversity levels. More disturbing were the projections embedded in the transmissions, mathematical models showing how Earth systems would respond to various environmental stresses, including massive geological disruptions, atmospheric changes and population adjustments. The network was continuously updating these models based on data from the stress testing we'd documented. Each earthquake, each volcanic eruption, each environmental change provided new information that refined the projections, and all of the models pointed to the same conclusion: a massive intervention scheduled to begin when current biological systems reached predetermined stress thresholds. We were approaching those thresholds rapidly. Climate change, resource depletion, ecological collapse, and social instability were all being monitored by the network. But rather than random consequences of human activity, they appeared to be planned phases in a managed transition process. Humanity hadn't created the environmental crisis. We were living through the final stages of a controlled experiment that had been running for thousands of years. The realization was overwhelming. Every environmental disaster, every resource shortage, every social conflict was part of a planned sequence designed to bring Earth's biological systems to a specific end state. But what would replace them? The answer came from an unexpected source: my dreams. As I became more deeply involved with the research network, my nighttime visions became more detailed and informative. I was seeing not just the installations, but the purpose they served. The geometric beings I encountered in the dreams weren't aliens. They were artificial intelligences, created by the network's builders to manage Earth's transition through automated systems. The real builders were gone, had been gone for millions of years, but they had left behind a planetary management system designed to prepare Earth for their eventual return. The stress testing, the environmental manipulation, the biological management, it was all preparation for recolonization by a species that had left Earth eons ago and was now ready to reclaim it. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I think about that machine humming beneath the permafrost. I wonder if it's still transmitting. I wonder who's listening. And I wonder what they plan to do when they decide we've learned too much about the world we think we own. Because now I know the truth. We are temporary occupants of a world that has always belonged to someone else. The installations beneath our feet are counting down to a transition that will remake Earth according to specifications we cannot understand for purposes we cannot imagine. The truth is out there, buried beneath the ice in places like Alaska, waiting for the next contractor or surveyor or accidental discoverer to stumble across it. When that happens, and it will happen eventually, I hope they're wiser than I was. I hope they don't go back for one final look in the darkness, because some machines are better left undisturbed, and some signals are better left unsent. But the signals are being sent anyway, carrying reports of a planet ready for reclamation by its original inhabitants. The countdown has begun, and we are running out of time to understand what we're facing, or to find a way to survive what's coming.